In tonight's true scary story, we're heading deep into a national park where the wilderness doesn't just erase people. It keeps their last words. This clip uncovers a real, feeling account centered on a missing person whose final message was discovered far from any trail, far from help, and long after search teams stopped looking. What makes this case unsettling isn't just that the person vanished, but what they chose to write before they did, and where those words were found. National parks are vast, silent, and indifferent. When someone disappears out there, the forest becomes both witness and accomplice. In this story, a single recovered message offers a glimpse into the final moments of someone who realized too late that they were no longer alone. Listen closely. Every detail matters because in places like this, the last thing a missing person leaves behind is rarely meant to be found, and even more rarely meant to be rid. This is a true scary story of isolation, desperation, and the final words left behind in the wilderness. My name is Caleb Morris. I am a data recovery consultant by profession, trained to reconstruct timelines from incomplete digital traces, corrupted phones, fragmented GPS pings, deleted messages that still leave statistical shadows behind. I state this not to impress, but to clarify that I am not prone to speculation. I work with verifiable records, with timestamps and coordinates, with facts that can be cross-checked. Everything I am about to describe occurred within a single 24-hour period, and every action I took was based on information that, at the time, appeared technically sound. The case began at 6:42 a.m. with a forwarded text message. It came from my sister Elaine, who rarely contacted me during workdays, unless something was wrong. The message itself was brief, stripped of context by the forwarding process. It read, "I'm here now. If you're reading this, I finally found it." There was no signature, but Elaine added a line above it. This was Dad's. It arrived at 3:17 a.m. from a number that's been inactive for years. Our father, Martin Morris, had been missing for 11 months. Not deceased, not declared legally dead, simply gone. His last confirmed activity had been a routine solo hiking permit filed for a state forest 2 hours north of where he lived. His phone last pinged near a service road that led nowhere notable. Search teams found nothing. No body, no equipment, no indication of foul play. Eventually, the case drifted into the quiet category investigators refer to as unresolved absence. The number Elaine mentioned had belonged to our father. I knew that because I had helped her close his digital accounts after his disappearance. The line had been terminated. Reactivating without carrier records was, to my knowledge, impossible. By 7:10 a.m., I had pulled the raw metadata Elaine forwarded. The message timestamp was intact. The routing headers were consistent with a standard SMS transmission, not an app-based spoof. More troubling was the location tag embedded in the carrier log. It was not approximate. It was precise to within 5 meters. Coordinates followed. They resolved cleanly in my software. Latitude, longitude, elevation. No errors. No corruption. I fed them into 3 separate mapping systems. All 3 returned the same result: no listed location, no road access, no land designation. Just a blank patch of green, as if the data had landed between recognized spaces. I zoomed out. The area was surrounded by mapped terrain, forests, minor trails, private land boundaries. The coordinates sat inside a gap, a small oval of nothing where something should have been. At 8:30 a.m., I was in my car. I told myself this was professional curiosity, not grief. That if the message had been generated by a delayed system error or an archived packet release, Confirming that fact in person would help close the case. Elaine did not argue when I told her where I was going. She only asked me to call if I lost signal. The drive took just under 2 hours. The last gas station sat beside a highway exit marked with a faded brown sign indicating recreational land. From there, the road narrowed and the forest pressed in. Cellular service dropped to intermittent bars, and then vanished entirely, just as my father's records had indicated months earlier. I parked at the edge of a gravel service road at 10:58 a.m. The coordinates were less than a mile away, straight through dense woodland. No trail marker pointed in that direction. I recorded my starting position, calibrated my compass, and entered the coordinates manually into my handheld GPS unit. The device accepted them without protest. As I walked, the forest behaved normally. Birds called. Insects moved through the underbrush. The ground was damp with morning dew. Yet I noticed something subtle after about 20 minutes. My GPS distance counter began to fluctuate. The number dropped as expected, then climbed again, then corrected itself in small, nervous jumps. I stopped, recalibrated, and continued. At exactly 11:47 a.m., the forest changed. It was not dramatic. There was no sudden silence, no visible boundary. The trees simply spaced themselves farther apart, and the undergrowth thinned into short, pale grass. Sunlight felt flatter, less directional. My GPS chirped once and displayed 0 meters remaining. I was standing at the coordinates. There was nothing there. No structure. No clearing large enough to suggest prior use. Just a shallow depression in the earth, oval-shaped, perhaps 6 feet long. The grass within it was pressed down, as if something heavy had rested there recently. I checked my phone. No signal. No emergency SOS. The time read 11:52 a.m. That was when my phone vibrated. The notification was a single incoming text. No number displayed. Just a timestamp. 11:52 a.m. The message read, "You're late." My immediate assumption was delayed delivery, some artifact of cached data. But the vibration was real. The battery indicator dropped by 2% instantly, as if the device had worked harder than necessary to receive it. I typed a response without thinking. "Where are you?" The sending animation stalled. Then, slowly, the message went through. A reply arrived almost immediately. "Still here, same as before." I did not ask what "before" meant. Instead, I opened the message details. The location tag was identical to the earlier one. Exactly where I was standing. At 12:03 p.m., the ground shifted. Not an earthquake. Not movement beneath my feet. The depression deepened, imperceptibly at first, like soil relaxing after pressure was removed. The grass folded inward. A smell rose, metallic, old, like rain on rusted tools. I stepped back. My GPS unit powered off on its own. Another text arrived. "Don't step away." That's how it resets. I froze, one foot lifted. Heart accelerating in a way I had not felt since the days immediately following my father's disappearance. I realized then that the place was not missing from the map by accident. It was not unrecorded. It was unlocatable unless summoned, traced by a signal that wanted to be followed. The last message came at 12:11 p.m. "Stay until it finishes remembering." I did not know what that meant. I still don't. What I know is that the depression continued to deepen, slowly shaping itself into something unmistakably human in outline. And I knew, with a certainty that bypassed logic, that leaving would not erase the place. It would only move it. I stayed. I tell myself now that it was a calculated decision, the kind a professional makes when confronted with anomalous data. In truth, I think I stayed, because the place felt unfinished with me. The way a sentence hangs open when the final word hasn't been spoken yet. Leaving felt less like retreat and more like interruption. The depression in the ground deepened until my boots rested against its sloping edge. The soil wasn't collapsing, it was compacting, drawing itself inward with slow precision. The outline sharpened, shoulders, a narrowing waist, the suggestion of legs. Not a grave, I realized. A mold. My phone vibrated again at 20:19 p.m. The message read, "It still works." I typed back with shaking fingers, "What is this place?" The response took longer. Long enough for me to notice the forest beyond the clearing hadn't moved at all. Leaves hung motionless. Even the insects were gone. It's where I stopped. The phone finally buzzed. Where I fit. The phrasing hit me harder than any threat could have. My father had always been meticulous with words. He believed clarity was a form of respect. Seeing that voice return, stripped down and literal, made my mouth go dry. I asked, "Are you alive?" Several minutes passed. The soil continued its slow remembering. I could now see indentations where arms would have rested, palms turned slightly upward. At first, the reply came. "Then not in the way you mean. Don't use that word. It confuses it." "What is eat?" I typed. The phone vibrated immediately, as if that question had been anticipated. "The map." I laughed once, sharply, the sound startling in the dead air. "This isn't on any map." I wrote. "I checked everything." Another pause. The light shifted, though the sun hadn't visibly moved. "That's because it isn't a place." The message came. "It's a remainder." The term made professional sense in a way that scared me. A remainder is what's left after a system finishes calculating after inputs have been resolved. Not an error. Not an omission. A residue. I asked, "Why text me now?" The reply did not come from my phone. It came from the ground. A vibration, subtle but distinct, passed through the soil, through my boots, up my legs. The depression shuddered once, then stilled. My phone buzzed half a second later, late to its own message. "Because you trace things," it said, "and because Elaine would have followed the dot instead of the distance." I swallowed hard. "You knew she forwarded it?" "Yes." At 12:41 p.m., my phone battery dropped to 18%. I had started the day with a full charge. No apps were running. No signal searching indicator flashed. The drain was coming from the messages themselves, as if each exchange required more power than my device could comfortably give. The mold in the ground was complete now. It was unmistakably human, and unmistakably wrong. The proportions were slightly off, stretched lengthwise, as if whoever had lain there had been pulled gently from both ends. "Did you lie down there?" I asked. "No," came the answer. I stood. It learned anyway. The air smelled stronger now, metallic and damp. I became aware of a low sound, just at the edge of hearing, like wind moving through a long, narrow corridor. When I turned my head, it faded. When I faced the depression again, it returned. What happens when it finishes remembering? I typed, echoing the earlier message. This time, the pause stretched on. My phone felt warm in my hand, warmer than it should have been. I checked the time. 1:03 p.m. finally. That depends on whether it keeps me. I stared at the screen. Keeps you where? A single word reply. Hair. The ground shifted again. Slowly, deliberately, the edges of the mold began to rise, lifting like the lip of a container, being shaped from soft clay. The depression was becoming concave, less like a print and more like a shallow basin. Panic crept in then, not as a spike but as a spreading cold. I took a step back despite the warning. Nothing reset. Nothing vanished. The place did not react at all. That was a test. The phone buzzed. Not a rule. I clenched my jaw. "You're not my father," I typed. "You're using his number." The reply came slower, heavier. "I am what fit when he didn't." The implication settled over me with awful clarity. My father had not been taken. He had been measured. At 1:17 p.m., the forest edge flickered. I don't have a better word for it. One moment the trees were there, solid and vertical. The next they seemed to misalign, like an image briefly failing to render. It lasted less than a second, but it was enough to make my vision blur and my stomach lurch. The phone buzzed again. "It's close now." "Close to what?" I demanded. "To finishing the outline," came the response. "That's why you were late. It had to start without you." My hands were shaking openly now. Why me? Another vibration, this one stronger, pulsed through the ground. The basin deepened, its sides smoothing, refining. "Because you brought the rest of the data," the phone said. Distance. Confirmation. Witness. The word witness echoed in my head, heavy with legal weight. Proof requires observation. Completion requires presence. At 1:29 p.m., my phone battery hit 7%. The screen dimmed. The low sound grew louder, resolving into something almost rhythmic, like breathing slowed to an inhuman pace. "If my phone dies." I typed quickly. "What happens?" The response came instantly, urgent for the first time. "Then it keeps the last thing it understood." "What's that?" I asked. The typing indicator appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. "That you came." The basin in the ground was deep enough now that I could no longer see its bottom clearly. Shadows pooled there, thick and lightless, swallowing detail. I felt a pull then, not physical but conceptual, like the suggestion of gravity applied to thought instead of matter. I realized, with sudden dread, that the place was not waiting for my father. It was waiting for continuity. And at 1:34 p.m., my phone went dark in my hand, cutting off the last message mid-vibration, leaving the sentence unfinished and the place very, very attentive. When my phone died, the sound stopped. Not faded. Stopped. Like a switch thrown somewhere deep and final. The low rhythmic pressure I'd been feeling through the ground vanished, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt padded. I could hear my own breathing too clearly, each inhale loud and intrusive, like noise in a room meant for listening to something else. I checked the screen out of reflex. Nothing. No vibration. No residual warmth. Just a black mirror reflecting my face back at me, pale and distorted by the angle of the light. The basin shifted. It didn't move toward me. It didn't grow. Instead, the shadow inside it sharpened, pulling inward, concentrating. The edges of the hollow became firmer, more defined, as if the place had reached a decision. I understood then what the text had meant. It keeps the last thing it understood. You came. The air thickened, not physically but perceptually. Depth flattened. Distance lost its meaning. When I looked at the trees beyond the clearing, they seemed closer than they should have been, their trunks too tall, their spacing subtly wrong. Not warped, exactly. Aligned to a different measurement. I backed away another step. This time, the ground reacted. The basin rippled once, like a surface acknowledging pressure. A sensation passed through my feet and up my spine, not forceful but directive. A correction. I stopped moving. I don't know how long I stood there. My watch said only 4 minutes, passed between my phone dying and the next change. But time felt unreliable, stretched thin, like it was being referenced instead of experienced. At 1:41 p.m., the basin rose. Not out of the ground, but within itself. The shadow inside it lifted, resolving into depth instead of absence. I could see contours now, subtle at first, then unmistakable. The suggestion of shoulders, a torso elongated, legs that didn't quite align with human proportion, as if the idea had been learned from observation, not experience. It wasn't emerging. It was assembling. I thought of my father standing here months ago, his phone in his hand, tracing coordinates that led him to the same blank space. I imagined him realizing, too late, that the place wasn't asking where he was. It was asking what fit. A pressure built behind my eyes. Images surfaced uninvited. My father teaching me how to read maps, how to orient myself without relying on technology. Tools fail, he used to say. Understanding lasts longer. I wondered what he'd understood in his final moments. Whether he'd recognized the remainder for what it was, or if he'd tried to solve it like a problem that still had an answer. The shape in the basin paused halfway to completion. I felt it then, a hesitation. Not uncertainty, evaluation. It was comparing. I took a step forward before I consciously decided to. The ground did not resist. The pressure eased slightly, like approval. I said aloud, my voice sounding wrong in the air, too thin. You already took one. The forest did not respond. The shape continued refining itself, smoothing edges, correcting proportions. It wasn't copying my father anymore. It was adjusting toward me. I understood the final piece then, the one my phone hadn't lived long enough to say. Continuity doesn't mean replacement. It means sequence. This place didn't remove people from the map. It completed them, one after another, refining its understanding of what a person was supposed to be. Each visitor left data behind. Height, weight, hesitation, resistance. Each one taught it a little more. And now it had enough. The shape reached a point where it could stand. I don't know what would have happened if it had. I don't know whether it would have worn my father's face, or mine, or something interpolated between the two. I only know that in that moment, the pressure shifted from invitation to insistence. So I did the only thing I hadn't tried. I lied. I reached into my pack and pulled out my backup GPS unit, the one I hadn't turned on, because it relied on a different satellite network, one with lower resolution and higher error tolerance. I powered it up with shaking hands and let it struggle for a fix. The screen flickered. Coordinates snapped into place, then drifted, then corrected again. I held it out over the basin. The place reacted immediately. The shadow inside it wavered, its edges blurring. The pressure spiked, sharp and disoriented, like static running through thought itself. The shape faltered, losing cohesion, limbs misaligning. I understood why then. It didn't like approximation. This place required precision. It fed on exactness, clean coordinates, verified presence, confirmed arrival. My first GPS, my phone, my tracing software had all given it certainty. This device gave it doubt. The basin convulsed once, collapsing inward, its careful structure breaking down into uneven depth. The air screamed, not audibly, but in sensation, like standing too close to a sudden drop. I ran. Not blindly, not away, sideways. I didn't follow distance. I broke alignment, moving perpendicular to the coordinates, forcing error into every step. The forest resisted, Not with branches or roots, but with perception. Trees seemed to slide, paths to curve back toward the clearing. I kept moving, counting steps, deliberately changing direction every 20 paces. At some point, sound returned. Birds, wind. The normal mess of the world rushed back in like a held breath released. I didn't stop until I hit the gravel service road. Lungs burning, legs trembling so badly, I had to sit down on the shoulder. My watch read 2:23 p.m. The entire encounter, arrival to escape, had taken less than 3 hours. I drove without thinking, following the road until cell service returned in a sudden burst of notifications. Missed calls. Messages from Elaine. I didn't answer until I was parked outside my apartment, hands steady enough to hold the phone again. Her voice broke when she heard mine. "Caleb," she said. "Did you find anything?" I looked at my phone screen, at the signal bars, at the map app that now showed nothing but forest where the coordinates had been. "Yes," I said carefully. "But it's gone now." "What is?" she asked. I didn't answer that. Instead, I asked her to do one thing for me. "Delete the message," I said. "And if anything else comes through from that number, don't open it. Don't forward it. Don't trace it." There was a pause. "Why?" "Because it doesn't send messages," I said. "It sends invitations." That night, at 11:58 p.m., as I lay awake replaying every second of the day, my phone vibrated once on the nightstand. No number. No preview. Just a notification banner that vanished before I could read it. When I checked the battery usage the next morning, there was a single spike at exactly that time, location services. Active for 1 second. From inside my apartment. Whatever I disrupted in the forest didn't disappear. It just learned a new way to finish remembering. My name is Henry Walsh. I am a senior archival analyst contracted to review raw media recovered during missing person investigations, a role that requires patience, detachment, and a strict adherence to documented facts. I had been doing this work for just over 11 years when I was assigned the footage that would end my career. The case itself was unremarkable on paper. A freelance documentary filmmaker named Evan Holt, last seen entering a protected forest reserve to capture supplemental footage for an environmental short. He failed to check out, failed to meet his extraction window, and was reported missing by his editor 48 hours later. Search teams found his campsite, his vehicle, and eventually his camera. They did not find him. The camera was a standard prosumer digital model, weather, sealed, solid-state storage. Nothing experimental. It had survived rain exposure and one minor drop, judging by the casing. When it arrived on my desk that morning, sealed in an evidence bag with the usual chain of custody tags, I had no expectation that it would contain anything beyond disjointed nature shots and the gradual decay into panic that tends to characterize final recordings. I logged the device, photographed its condition, and began the standard intake process. The entire review was scheduled to be completed in 1 day. A routine turnaround that matched the department's backlog policy. I remember glancing at the wall clock when I powered the camera on. It was 08:17. The first hour of footage was uneventful. Evan narrated intermittently, describing tree density, light conditions, and ambient sound. His voice was calm, professional, slightly distant, as if already imagining the edit rather than the moment. The camera work reflected that mindset. Slow pans, careful framing, deliberate focus pulls. I noted timestamps, environmental markers, and any deviations from his stated itinerary. Everything aligned with his filed plan. Around mid-morning, he reached a narrow valley where the canopy thickened and the light flattened into a dull, uniform gray. The audio picked up the constant presence and distant water. Still normal. At 11:42, there was the first anomaly, though I did not recognize it as such at the time. Evan paused his narration mid-sentence. The camera continued recording, pointed at a stand of trees. After several seconds, he cleared his throat and resumed speaking, but his tone had shifted. It was subtle. The kind of change you only notice when you are trained to listen for it. He sounded distracted, as if his attention had been pulled elsewhere and forcibly returned. I marked it as a possible wildlife interruption and continued. The trail narrowed after noon. The footage became more mobile, the camera bobbing with his stride. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the ground, despite the sun still being high according to the metadata. Evan commented on the light, expressing mild confusion, then laughed it off. He joked about losing track of time, about how easy it was to get disoriented under dense cover. His laughter did not quite land. It ended too abruptly, like a switch flipped off rather than a natural fade. At 13:06, the camera stopped moving. The image settled on a section of forest floor, littered with needles and broken branches. Evan did not speak. There was a sound then, faint but distinct, like fabric brushing against bark. The camera remained fixed for nearly a full minute. Then, without Evan's hands entering the frame, it rotated slightly to the left. I replayed that segment twice before noting it. The movement was smooth, controlled, not the result of a stumble or a shifting grip. It resembled a deliberate adjustment, the kind a person makes when reframing a shot. But Evan's breathing, audible in the background, suggested he was not touching the camera. It had deepened, become uneven, as if he were holding himself very still. From that point on, the footage changed in ways that were difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. Evan spoke less. When he did, his words were clipped, functional, stripped of narrative flourish. He announced directions, landmarks, times. He sounded like someone trying to anchor himself through routine. Several times, the camera drifted away from whatever he claimed to be filming, turning instead toward dense clusters of trees or empty stretches of shadow. Each movement was slow, almost cautious, as if the camera itself were hesitant. By mid-afternoon, Evan began to acknowledge it. Not directly, not with panic, but with careful, measured statements. He mentioned feeling watched. He corrected himself, saying it was probably just the isolation. He noted that the forest was quieter than expected, that even the insects seemed distant. At 15:19, he stopped walking and whispered, "Did you hear that?" There was no obvious sound spike in the audio waveform, nothing a casual listener would flag. Yet the camera tilted upward, centering on the dark mass of branches overhead. I leaned closer to the monitor at that point, my earlier detachment eroding into something more alert. I reminded myself that human perception is unreliable under stress, that cameras capture only what they are pointed at, nothing more. Still, I could not shake the growing impression that the camera was reacting to stimuli, independent of Evan's conscious intent. It tracked movement that I could not see. It lingered on empty spaces, as if waiting for something to enter the frame. The most unsettling moment came at 16:03. Evan was standing near what appeared to be a dried streambed. He was breathing hard, sweat audible as it dripped onto the ground. He said very quietly, "I'm not turning it." The camera, as if in response, pivoted sharply to the right. I paused the footage and checked the technical data. No signs of corruption. No automated stabilization artifacts that could explain the motion. I advanced the clip frame by frame. The rotation was clean, continuous, driven. Even made a sound then, a short exhale that bordered on a sob. He did not look in the direction the camera had turned. He was staring straight ahead, off frame, as if whatever held his attention was too important, or too frightening, to look away from. By the time the footage cut to black at 17:11, I realized I had not moved from my chair in hours. The daylight outside my office window had begun to fade, mirroring the dimness creeping into the recorded forest. I checked the clock again. It was still the same day. Only 9 hours had passed since I started, but it felt longer, stretched thin by the accumulation of small, impossible details. I saved my notes, labeled the anomalies, and prepared to continue. I told myself that what I was seeing had explanations, that all footage does. At that moment, I still believed that. I resumed the review immediately, refusing to leave the room while there was still daylight outside the window. That felt important, though I could not have explained why at the time. I noted the clock again before continuing. It was 17:26. The footage resumed with the same fixed perspective, the camera angled slightly downward, capturing Evan's boots at the edge of the dried streambed. He did not move for several seconds. His breathing was loud now, no longer masked by ambient sound. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse, as if he had been whispering for a long time. He said he was going to turn the camera off. He said he needed to conserve battery, that he needed to focus on getting back to the trail. The words were rational, procedural, the kind of things people say when they are trying to convince themselves they are still in control. The camera did not turn off. Instead, it tilted upward again, slowly, framing the opposite bank of the streambed. There was nothing there. No movement, no shape that resolved into anything recognizable. Just shadow layered on shadow. Even went silent. His footsteps retreated slightly, crunching against gravel. The camera followed him without hesitation, maintaining the same distance, the same angle. I replayed that segment 3 times, watching the subtle synchronization between his movement and the camera's response. It was too precise to be accidental. I wrote in my notes that the device appeared to be tracking the subject autonomously, then immediately crossed it out. That phrasing implied agency. I replaced it with something safer, something bureaucratic and vague. The forest grew darker as the footage progressed, not abruptly but with a gradual thickening of shadow that felt out of sync with the time stamps. According to the metadata, sunset was still over an hour away. Avon commented on this discrepancy, his voice trembling despite his efforts to sound calm. He laughed once, a short, sharp sound that ended in a cough. He said the canopy must be denser than he thought. He said he would keep moving. At 18:02, the camera swung sharply to the left, faster than any previous movement. Avon gasped. The sound was involuntary, pulled from him before he could stop it. He whispered, "Don't," and then, after a pause, "Please don't." I felt a cold sensation creep up my arms as I listened. The request was not directed at the camera in the abstract. It was specific, intimate, as if he were addressing something with the capacity to listen and respond. From that point on, the footage became increasingly difficult to watch. Evan began narrating his actions in real time, stating each step before he took it, as though verbalizing his intentions might prevent interference. The camera did not always comply. Several times, it lagged behind him, lingering on empty patches of forest before snapping back to his position. Other times, it anticipated his movement, turning toward paths he had not yet taken. I noticed then that Evan never once addressed what he was seeing directly. He described sounds, sensations, the feeling of pressure behind his eyes, but he avoided naming the source of his fear. It was as if acknowledging it might give it shape. The camera, however, had no such restraint. It fixated on spaces just beyond the edge of visibility, on gaps between trees where the darkness seemed deeper, more deliberate. At 1837, Evan stopped abruptly. The camera continued moving for another second, then corrected itself, swinging back toward him. He was standing rigid, shoulders hunched, his head tilted slightly as if listening. He said very quietly that it was close now. He said he could tell because the forest felt wrong, like a room with the air sucked out. The audio confirmed an unnatural stillness. Even his breathing seemed muffled, swallowed by the absence of ambient noise. I paused the footage again, aware of a growing tension in my own body. My jaw ached from clenching. I checked the room around me, grounding myself in the familiar details of my office, the hum of the computer, the faint reflection of my face in the darkened monitor. I reminded myself that fear is contagious, that recorded panic can trigger physiological responses in viewers. Then I pressed play. Night fell in the footage with alarming speed. Within minutes, the image degraded into a grainy wash of blacks and grays, illuminated only by the camera's low, light compensation. Evan's voice dropped to a whisper. He said he could not see the trail anymore. He said the camera was no longer pointing where he needed to go. He tried to grab it then. For the first time, his hands entered the frame, fingers brushing the lens as he reached out. The camera jerked away violently, the image blurring as it spun. Evan cried out, a raw, animal sound that made me flinch. He stumbled, the audio capturing the impact as he fell against something solid. Wood, perhaps, or rock. The camera steadied itself several feet away, angled back toward him. He was on his knees, hands raised defensively, staring at something off frame. He shook his head over and over, repeating the same word under his breath. No. At 1914, he addressed the camera directly. He said if anyone was watching this, they needed to know that he hadn't planned to come here. He said the trail wasn't on his map, that it wasn't there when he started. His voice broke when he admitted that he could no longer tell where he was, that the forest no longer matched his memory. The camera inched closer as he spoke, closing the distance with unsettling intimacy. The last clear thing he said before the footage degraded further was, "It's not behind the camera." The implication of that statement hit me harder than anything else I had seen. I felt a wave of nausea rise. My earlier rationalizations crumbling under the weight of that single observation. If what he feared was not behind the camera, then the camera was not observing it from a safe remove. It was aligned with it, or guided by it. The footage did not end there. It continued, recording darkness and fragmented sound, Evan's breathing growing fainter, more erratic. I watched until my eyes burned and my hands trembled, until the clock on the wall ticked past 2000. Outside, the last of the daylight was gone. I realized then that I was afraid to stop, afraid of what might happen if I did. Still, I knew there was more. The camera's battery indicator suggested it had recorded well into the night, and I had not yet reached the final file. I hesitated before opening the final segment of the file, my cursor hovering over the timeline as if the footage itself might react to being observed again. The clock on my wall read 2018. The building was quiet, most of the staff gone for the day, leaving only the low electrical hum that fills empty offices at night. I told myself that finishing the review in one sitting was the professional thing to do. I told myself that stopping now would only prolong the unease. I pressed play. The image was almost entirely black. The camera's low light mode strained to extract detail from the darkness, producing a grainy, pulsing field of gray. Evan's breathing was still audible, but it was distant now, uneven, as if he were no longer holding the camera close. There was a faint rhythmic sound beneath it, something slow and deliberate. At first, I mistook it for footsteps. After a moment, I realized it was not moving across the ground. It was circling. Evan spoke again at 2041, his voice barely more than air. He said he had tried to run. He said the ground kept changing under his feet, sloping where it shouldn't, softening without warning. He said he had fallen more times than he could count. The camera shifted slightly as he spoke, reorienting itself toward a darker concentration of shadow. There was still nothing visible there, but the image quality degraded further, as if the sensor were struggling to process whatever occupied that space. What unsettled me most was Evan's tone. The panic I had expected never fully arrived. Instead, there was a resigned clarity to his words, the kind that comes when fear has burned itself out, leaving only acceptance behind. He said he thought it wanted him tired. He said it waited until he stopped resisting. The camera moved closer again, its motion smooth and unhurried. At 2107, Evan began to cry. Not loudly. Quietly, almost politely. He apologized repeatedly, though he never clarified to whom. The camera angled downward, capturing his hands resting limply in his lap. They were shaking. His fingers were scraped raw, streaked with dried blood. The light adjusted, brightening the image just enough to make the damage visible. I felt my stomach tighten. This was not footage meant for documentation. It felt intrusive, like witnessing something private and irreversible. There was a sound then that made my breath catch. A voice, low and indistinct, emerging from the static. It did not resolve into words, but it carried cadence, intention. Evan froze. His crying stopped mid-breath. The camera tilted upward in response, framing a wall of darkness so dense it seemed to swallow the surrounding image. Evan whispered, "I can see it now." He did not elaborate. From that point on, the camera no longer behaved as if it were merely following. It led. It advanced steadily, pulling the frame forward while Evan lagged behind, his footsteps uneven. He begged then, not with urgency but with wary insistence. He asked it to let him rest. He asked it to stop showing him things he could not understand. The camera did not slow. At 2133, the forest reappeared briefly, illuminated by a pale, diffuse light that did not resemble moonlight. The trees looked wrong. Their trunks bent at unnatural angles, converging toward a central point beyond the frame. Evan stopped walking. He said the place felt familiar, like somewhere he had dreamed about as a child. The camera zoomed in, focusing on a gap between two trees where the light seemed to pool. I leaned back in my chair, my pulse loud in my ears. I was acutely aware of the darkened window behind me, of my own reflection layered over the footage. The sensation that I was not alone in that room had grown impossible to ignore. Still, I watched. The final minutes were fragmented. The camera shook violently, the image blurring as if subjected to sudden force. Evan screamed once, a sharp, tearing sound that cut off abruptly. There was a crash, then silence. When the image stabilized again, the camera lay on its side, pointed at the forest floor. Evan was no longer visible. His breathing was gone. In its place was that slow, circling sound, closer now, almost intimate. At 21:58, the camera lifted itself. There was no transition, no visible mechanism. One moment it lay still, the next it was upright, held at a height consistent with Evan's eye level. It turned, scanning the surrounding trees with methodical precision. I felt a chill settle deep in my chest. The footage no longer resembled a record of events. It felt like a survey. The last thing recorded before the battery finally died was a brief glimpse of movement at the edge of the frame. Not a clear shape. Not something I could describe with confidence. Just a distortion in the darkness, as if the forest itself were shifting to accommodate something passing through it. The camera lingered there, attentive, until the image cut to black. I sat in silence for a long time after that, the playback bar frozen at the end of the timeline. The clock read 22:14. The entire review had taken less than 14 hours. All within a single day, yet it felt as though I had aged years in that span. I compiled my final report with trembling hands, sticking to technical observations, avoiding speculation. I flagged the footage as inconclusive, citing environmental stress and potential equipment malfunction. It was the safest language I could use. I never submitted the personal note I wrote afterward, the one where I admitted that the camera's movements defied mechanical explanation, that its focus suggested awareness. I deleted it instead. Within a week, I resigned from my position, citing health reasons. I did not watch the footage again. Sometimes, late night, I think about that final moment, the way the camera seemed to turn with purpose, as if searching. I think about Evan's last words, about how he said it was not behind the camera. And I wonder, with a growing sense of dread, whether the footage ended because the battery died, or because there was no longer any need to record. My name is Trevor Lang. I am writing this as a formal record of events that took place over the course of a single day, because I no longer trust my own memory to remain intact. What I experienced does not rely on superstition, hallucination, or anything that cannot be explained through ordinary means. Every object I touched existed. Every location can be found on a map. Every decision I made was rational at the time. That is precisely why I am documenting it now. I work as a field technician for a regional environmental survey contractor. My job involves visiting remote sites, collecting soil and water samples, checking automated monitoring stations, and documenting human impact in protected areas. I am not a ranger, not law enforcement, and not trained for search and rescue. I am, however, accustomed to isolation, long hours outdoors, and the mundane logistics of wilderness work. I have spent years alone in forests without incident. On the morning this began, I was assigned a single-day site inspection in a state-managed conservation area that borders a larger national park. The location was unremarkable. A short service road, a trail used primarily by maintenance crews, and a decommissioned observation clearing near a seasonal stream. No campgrounds, no public facilities, and no reason for anyone to be there without official business. I arrived just after sunrise. My truck was the only vehicle at the gate. I signed in, unlocked the access barrier, and followed the dirt road until it narrowed into a trailhead marked by a weathered post and a laminated notice about erosion control. I parked, packed my equipment, and began walking. The first few hours were routine. I logged readings from 2 monitoring stations, took photographs of the streambed, and recorded notes about recent rainfall. The ground was damp in places, the kind of lingering moisture that follows a night of light rain. Nothing about it stood out at the time. It was nearing midday when I noticed the plastic. It was caught low in the brush, snagged on a thorny branch just off the trail. At first glance, I assumed it was litter, a piece of trash carried in by wind or water. That alone was unusual given the restricted access, but not alarming. I stepped closer to remove it. The plastic was thick, the kind used for heavy-duty document protection or evidence storage. It was sealed along the edges, folded carefully, not torn or punctured. Inside, I could see paper. What stopped me was the condensation. The inside of the plastic was fog, dotted with small beads of moisture that clung to the surface and slowly slid downward when I shifted it in my hand. The paper inside looked saturated, darker in patches, warped slightly as if it had absorbed liquid, and then partially dried. I remember thinking that it must have been placed there very recently. Paper left outdoors overnight would show signs of dirt intrusion, insects, or damage from temperature changes. This did not. The moisture was clean, clear, as if it had come from a human source. I did not open it immediately. I scanned the area, looking for footprints, disturbed soil, or signs of a campsite. There were none. The trail was undisturbed except for my own boot prints and faint animal tracks. The brush around me was dense enough that placing the packet there would have required deliberate effort. I returned to the clearing where I had set my pack and sat down on a fallen log. I removed my gloves, dried my hands, and carefully opened the seal. Inside was a single sheet of lined notebook paper, folded twice. The ink had run in places, but the writing was still legible. It was neat, consistent, and written with a steady hand. This was not a frantic scrawl. The first line read, "I'm sorry to whoever finds this." It was a farewell note. The contents were brief. The writer apologized to their family, referenced a sense of being finished, and stated that they did not want to be searched for. There was no name, no date, and no explicit mention of intent, but the implication was clear. The final line read, "I needed to stop moving." What unsettled me most was the condition of the paper. The ink was smeared downward in thin streaks, as if tears had fallen onto it while it was being written. The moisture pattern was uneven, concentrated in the center, exactly where someone would have leaned over the page. The paper was still cool to the touch. I checked my watch. It was early afternoon. I stood up and walked the perimeter of the clearing, scanning the tree line, listening. The forest was quiet in the way forests often are during midday. No voices. No movement beyond the occasional bird. Protocol required that I report the note. I took photographs, sealed it back inside the plastic, marked the GPS coordinates, and contacted my supervisor via satellite phone. He instructed me to remain at the site while he notified the appropriate authorities. While waiting, I made a decision that, in hindsight, I should not have made. I followed the trail beyond the clearing. The maintenance path continued downhill toward the stream, narrowing as it went. I told myself I was simply surveying the area, looking for signs that could help responders later. I moved slowly, watching the ground. About 100 meters from the clearing, I found the first footprint. It was a boot print, partially obscured by damp soil, but unmistakably human. It was not mine. The tread pattern was different, and the direction indicated movement away from the trail toward the thicker woods. I followed it. The footprints were intermittent, appearing only where the ground held moisture. There was no sign of haste, no scuffing or irregular stride. Whoever had walked here had done so calmly. As I moved deeper, I noticed the air felt heavier. Not warmer or colder, just dense, as if humidity had increased sharply over a short distance. My equipment fogged slightly. I slowed my pace. That was when I realized something that made my stomach tighten. The footprints were fresh enough that water was still seeping into the impressions. The soil had not rebounded yet. Whoever left them had passed through less than an hour earlier. I stopped walking and called out, identifying myself. My voice sounded muted, absorbed by the trees. There was no response. I considered turning back. Authorities were already on their way. I had no obligation to continue. Instead, I noticed something else on the ground ahead. Another piece of plastic, partially buried under leaves, its edge catching the light. And inside it, barely visible through the dirt and condensation, was another folded sheet of paper. I stood there for a long moment, aware of my own breathing, aware that the forest remained utterly indifferent to my presence. I did not know then that the note I had found was not the first, and it would not be the last. I did not pick up the second note right away. I stood still, forcing myself to slow my breathing, listening for anything that might indicate another person nearby. Wind moved through the upper branches, but at ground level the air remained strangely still. The plastic on the forest floor glistened faintly, the moisture inside catching the filtered sunlight. I marked the location on my GPS before approaching. The packet was identical to the first. Thick plastic, edges heat, sealed, folded with care. Dirt clung to one corner where it had pressed into the soil. When I lifted it, water droplets slid along the inside surface, fresh enough to merge and run. The paper inside was the same kind of lined notebook sheet. I opened it with the same deliberate care as before, already aware that whatever I read would change how the rest of the day unfolded. This note was longer. The opening line read, "I didn't expect anyone to follow." That alone made my chest tighten. The writer described walking until the trail noise faded, until they could no longer hear their own footsteps echo back at them. They mentioned choosing places where the ground stayed damp, because it made walking quieter. They apologized again, this time not just to family, but to the person behind me, clarifying that it wasn't meant literally. The wording was careful, almost clinical. Halfway down the page, the ink blurred more heavily. The moisture pattern suggested prolonged contact, as if the paper had been held close to a face for several minutes. The final lines read, "I'm still here. I just needed to be certain you would stop." I checked my surroundings immediately. There was no sound of movement. No snapped branches, no rustle of leaves. The forest remained static, like a paused image. I turned slowly in a full circle, scanning between the trunks. Rational explanations came quickly. This could have been written days earlier. The moisture could be from condensation caused by temperature changes. The wording could be coincidence, intentionally vague. There was no reason to assume the writer was nearby. And yet, the footprints, leading away from the clearing, had been fresh. I returned the note to its plastic sleeve, sealed it, and placed it carefully back where I found it. I did not want to disturb the scene further. I began walking back toward the trail, retracing my steps. That was when I noticed the third set of footprints. They overlapped mine. They were identical to the earlier prints in size and tread, but positioned closer together, as if the person had slowed or shortened their stride. The impressions were crisp, edges sharp, water already pooling inside. They were facing the direction I had just come from. I stopped. The realization came gradually, assembling itself piece by piece. The rider had not only moved through this area recently. They had changed direction. They had turned back. I called out again, louder this time, stating that help was on the way, and that I was not there to interfere. My voice carried farther now, but still nothing answered. I began walking faster, keeping my eyes forward, resisting the urge to constantly look over my shoulder. My training told me not to panic, not to assign intent without evidence, but my instincts were no longer aligned with protocol. As I approached the clearing, I saw something that had not been there before. A strip of bright orange survey tape was tied loosely around the trunk of a tree near my pack. I was certain of this. I had not placed it there, and I would have noticed it earlier. The tape fluttered gently, though the air around me felt unmoving. Attached to it was another plastic packet. This one hung at chest height. I did not touch it immediately. I stood several steps away, scanning the tree line, listening for breathing, footsteps, anything human. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. When I finally reached out, the plastic felt warm. Not sun-warmed, body-warm. I opened it. The handwriting was the same. "I didn't want to scare you," it read. "But I needed to know if you'd keep following, even after you understood." The note went on to describe the clearing from the writer's perspective. It mentioned my truck at the gate, the color of my pack, the way I had checked my watch after finding the first note. These were observations made in real time. One line, underlined twice, read, "You walk like someone who listens for answers." I stepped back, my heel catching on a root, nearly losing my balance. I turned sharply, scanning behind me. Nothing. I backed away from the tree, shouldered my pack, and began moving toward the trailhead without attempting to remain quiet. If someone was watching, I wanted them to know I was leaving. My satellite phone buzzed in my pocket. My supervisor informed me that local authorities were en route, but would take several hours due to the terrain. He told me to stay put if possible. I told him I could not. I did not explain why. I only said that there was reason to believe the writer of the notes was still in the area and actively moving. There was a pause on the line before he agreed that I should return to my vehicle. As I walked, I became aware of subtle changes around me. Leaves disturbed where I had not stepped, branches swaying slightly after I passed. Once, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but when I stopped, they stopped too. I did not run. I kept my pace steady, deliberate, refusing to escalate the situation in ways I could not control. Halfway to the trailhead, I found the final note. It lay directly in the center of the path, impossible to miss. No plastic this time. Just the paper, damp and darkened, held in place by a small stone. I knew I should not read it. I read it anyway. "I'm done now," it said. "You proved what I needed. I won't follow you past the road." I did not look around when I finished reading. I placed the paper back on the ground and continued walking until the trees thinned and the gate came into view. I did not stop until I reached my truck. When I drove away, I checked the rearview mirror repeatedly, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the woods. There was no one there. The authorities found no trace of another person when they arrived later that day. No campsites. No additional footprints. No notes. They told me the paper showed no usable DA beyond my own. But that night, as I cleaned my gear, I found moisture inside one of my sealed sample bags. And folded inside it was a piece of lined paper I did not recognize. I did not sleep that night. I remained awake long enough for exhaustion to become something dull and distant. Like background noise I could no longer turn off. I replayed the events of the day in strict order, searching for errors in judgment, moments where fear might have distorted perception. I wrote everything down while it was still fresh, including the precise time stamps from my GPS logs and call records. By any objective measure, the encounter should have ended when I left the conservation area. The writer had stated clearly that they would not follow past the road. There was no indication of pursuit. No evidence of forced entry or tampering with my vehicle. I drove directly home and did not stop along the way. And yet the note I found inside my sealed sample bag made it impossible to accept that the situation was resolved. The bag had been rolled shut and clipped, as required by procedure. It had remained in my pack from the moment I left the clearing until I unpacked at home. There was no reasonable opportunity for someone else to place anything inside it. The paper was folded once, cleanly. The ink was dry. The message was brief. You don't need to listen anymore. I disposed of that note the same way I did the others, sealing it in a separate bag, photographing it, and documenting the circumstances. I contacted my supervisor again, this time insisting on a formal incident report. He advised me to step back from field work until the matter could be reviewed. By morning, authorities had concluded that there was insufficient evidence of a crime. Without a missing person report, without a body, and without corroborating physical traces, there was nothing actionable. They suggested stress, coincidence, and environmental factors. One officer gently implied that isolation can heighten pattern recognition. I did not argue. I knew how it sounded. What I did not mention was the moisture. Despite being indoors, despite stable temperature and humidity, the note from my bag showed the same faint dampness as the others. Not enough to soak through, but enough to warp the fibers slightly, as if it had been handled recently. Later that afternoon, I returned to my truck to retrieve equipment. I had forgotten to unload. The vehicle had been locked since I arrived home. Nothing appeared disturbed. On the passenger seat lay a folded piece of paper. No plastic. No attempt at concealment. I stood outside the open door for a long time before touching it. The writing was the same. I said I wouldn't follow past the road. It read, I didn't say I wouldn't stay close. The note described my house accurately. The position of the windows. The way the porch light flickered before fully turning on. It referenced the sound my steps made on the gravel driveway. There were no threats. No demands. Just observation. I contacted the police again. They searched the area around my home, found nothing, and advised me to stay with a friend if I felt unsafe. They could not justify surveillance or patrols without clearer evidence. That evening, I packed a bag and drove to a motel on the edge of town. I chose it deliberately. Cameras. staff, activity. I wanted witnesses. I slept briefly, waking often, checking the locks, the window, the space beneath the bed. Nothing happened, no notes, no disturbances. By morning I felt foolish, embarrassed. The rational part of my mind asserted itself again. Someone could have followed me from the conservation area. Someone with time, patience, and a desire to unsettle rather than harm. The notes were psychological, not physical threats. I returned home before noon. The front door was still locked. Inside, everything appeared exactly as I had left it, except for one detail. On my kitchen table sat a sealed plastic packet, the same kind as before. My hands shook as I picked it up. The condensation inside was heavier this time, droplets already merging and sliding down the inner surface. The paper within was visibly wet. I did not open it right away. I walked through the house first, checking every room, every closet, every window. Nothing was out of place. No sign of forced entry. When I finally opened the packet, I found 2 sheets of paper. The first was familiar handwriting. "You kept listening even after you left," it said. That's why this worked. The second page was different. It was my own writing. Not copied. Not imitated. It was a page torn from my field notebook, one I recognized immediately. It contained notes I had written that morning, before leaving for the motel, about soil composition and weather conditions from an unrelated assignment months earlier. The ink matched. The pressure marks matched. The small habit of underlining dates twice was there. The page was wet. That was the moment something shifted in me. Not toward panic, but toward a quieter, heavier understanding. This was not about pursuit. It was about proximity. The writer did not need to follow me physically. They needed attention, awareness, recognition, the act of noticing, of reading, of listening, created whatever connection allowed this to continue. I placed the papers back into the plastic and sealed it. I did not call the police again. I did not contact my supervisor. Instead, I made a decision. I stopped documenting. I put away my notebooks, my recorder, my camera. I removed batteries. I stopped reviewing timestamps and logs. I deliberately avoided replaying the sequence of events. When my mind began to circle back, I redirected it to something immediate and mundane. Over the following days, the notes stopped appearing. No paper in my bag. No packets in my home. No messages left in places that assumed my attention. The moisture disappeared from my sealed equipment. The condensation did not return. Weeks have passed now. I am writing this from memory, without consulting my original records. I am doing so because I have been asked, repeatedly, to explain why I resigned from field work, why I requested reassignment to an office role, why I avoid remote sites. I have not told them everything. What I will say is this. If you find a message that feels personal despite having no name, if it seems written for whoever chooses to read it, understand that the act of engagement may be the only requirement it needs. Some things do not want to be followed. They want to be noticed. And once you prove that you will keep listening, they have no reason to let go. My name is Trevor Lang. I am writing this down while the details are still clear, while I can still separate what I know for certain from what I only felt. I work as a seasonal maintenance contractor for a large state managed wilderness reserve in the northern part of the country. My job is unremarkable trail inspections, erosion checks, clearing fallen branches, reporting damaged signage. I am not a ranger, not law enforcement, and not trained for search and rescue, beyond basic wilderness first aid. On the morning this happened, I believed that distinction mattered. The day began shortly after sunrise. The weather was mild for late autumn, the kind of quiet, gray morning where sound carries too far, and the forest feels hollow rather than alive. I had been assigned to inspect a lesser used loop trail that branches off from a popular overlook and winds through a low marsh before reconnecting near an old service road. It was not a place most visitors lingered. The trail dipped and twisted through reeds and thin trees, and after heavy rains, sections of it often flooded. Complaints had come in about torn trail markers and debris, nothing unusual. I parked at the pull-off and logged my entry time in the vehicle sheet. There were no other cars. That, too, was not unusual. The trailhead sign was intact, the map board dry. I checked my radio. Weak signal, but that was expected in that area. I started walking just after 8:10 a.m., following the narrow dirt path as it disappeared into the trees. About 40 minutes in, I noticed something that did not fit. A small plastic bag lay just off the trail, partially tucked under a clump of sedge grass. At first glance, it looked like trash, something a careless hiker might have dropped. I would have walked past it if the sunlight had not caught the surface at the right angle. The plastic was clean, not weathered, and weighted so it would not blow away. I stepped off the trail and picked it up. It was sealed tightly, folded over several times. The edges pressed flat as if someone had taken care to keep whatever was inside dry. Through the plastic, I could see paper. White, unlined, folded into a square. What stopped me was the moisture. The inside of the bag was fogged, dotted with tiny droplets. It had not rained that morning. There was no standing water nearby. The dampness was internal. I told myself it was condensation, that the bag had been left overnight and warmed in the sun. That explanation satisfied me for exactly 3 seconds. I opened the bag. Inside was a handwritten note. The paper was thick and soft, like stationery. The ink was dark blue and had not run, even where the paper was visibly wet. The moisture had soaked the fibers unevenly, leaving darker patches along the folds. When I unfolded it, my hands shook more than I expected. The note was short, 4 paragraphs, no name at the top, no date. The handwriting was neat but hesitant, as if the writer had paused often, reconsidering each line. The first sentence was an apology. The second explained that the writer had not intended for anyone to find this place, but had run out of time. The third asked whoever read it not to follow, not to look, and not to report what was written until the end of the day. The final paragraph said goodbye. What made my stomach tighten was the last line. It was underlined, pressed so hard into the paper that the indentation showed through the back. I am still crying while I seal this. I stood there longer than I should have, listening to the quiet, aware of my own breathing in a way that felt intrusive. The note did not mention danger. It did not mention fear. It read like a careful conclusion, not a panic. And yet, the tears described were still present, damp against my fingers. Protocol says that any personal effects found on a trail should be reported immediately. Protocol says potential suicide notes should not be handled beyond what is necessary to secure them. Protocol also says not to jump to conclusions. I folded the paper back into its original shape, resealed the plastic bag, and placed it carefully into my pack. I told myself I would radio it in once I reached higher ground. As I continued along the trail, I began noticing other things. The ground showed signs of recent disturbance, Flattened grass, scuffed soil. But not in a straight line, not like someone walking or running. It looked as if someone had stopped repeatedly, shifted their weight, stood still for long periods. There were no footprints I could clearly identify, just impressions that suggested hesitation. The trail curved toward the marsh. The air grew cooler, heavier. I checked my watch. It was still before 10:00 a.m. The light should have been stronger, but the trees seemed to swallow it. I reached for my radio again. Static, then nothing. I considered turning back. I did not. At the time, I told myself it was because I needed to complete my inspection. In truth, I think the note had already claimed more of my attention than I wanted to admit. It felt unfinished, like a conversation cut short. Near the edge of the marsh, I saw something else. A second plastic bag, identical to the first, tied to a low branch with a length of twine. This one hung at eye level, swaying slightly. There was no condensation on the inside. No note visible. I did not open it. I stood there, aware that the day was still young, that whatever had happened recently, and that I was alone with evidence I did not yet understand. The forest was silent in a way that felt deliberate, as if sound itself was waiting. I took the first bag out of my pack again. The paper inside was still damp. I did not open the second bag, but I did not leave it where it was, either. I untied the twine and held the plastic between my fingers, careful not to squeeze it. It was lighter than the first one. Empty, or nearly empty. I slipped it into my pack beside the other, telling myself I would document everything properly once I had a signal. That lie came easily. The marsh spread out ahead of me in a shallow basin, reeds bending under their own weight, water dark and still between them. The trail narrowed to a series of wooden planks laid years ago to keep hikers above the mud. Some of them had shifted, sunk at odd angles. I stepped carefully, testing each one before putting my weight down. With every step, I became more aware of the quiet. No insects. No birds. Even the wind seemed to stop once I crossed onto the boards. About halfway across, I noticed something reflective ahead. At first I thought it was water catching the light, but as I moved closer, the shape resolved into another sealed plastic bag, this one resting directly on the planks as if deliberately placed. I stopped several feet away. My instinct was to photograph it, but my phone showed no signal and the camera app lagged when I opened it, the screen dimming, as if the battery were low. Though it wasn't. I crouched and picked the bag up. This one contained a note. The paper was folded differently, creased more sharply, as if refolded several times. When I opened it, the dampness was immediate, cold against my skin. The handwriting matched the first note exactly. Same careful loops. Same pressure marks. This one was shorter. It said that walking had become difficult. That stopping felt easier than moving. That the writer had tried to keep their hands steady, but failed. There was a line crossed out near the bottom, pressed so hard the paper tore slightly. Beneath it, rewritten smaller, was a sentence that made me look up from the page and scan the marsh without thinking. I can hear him when I stand still. There was no explanation of who he was. No description. No accusation. Just the statement. Written as fact. I sealed the note back into its bag and stood. My heart was beating faster now, not from exertion, but from the growing awareness that this was no longer abandoned property. These notes had been placed intentionally, recently, along a single route. I checked my watch again. It was just past 1100 m. If someone was still out here, Injured or in distress? I needed to report it. I tried the radio again. This time, a burst of static resolved briefly into a fragment of sound. Something like breathing, uneven and close, before cutting out completely. I stared at the radio as if it had betrayed me. The trail left the marsh and climbed slightly into a stand of thin trees. The ground here was firmer, covered in a mat of fallen leaves. I moved more quickly, my eyes scanning ahead, behind to either side. I told myself I was looking for signs of the person who wrote the notes. I did not tell myself what part of me was afraid of finding them. The third bag was harder to see. It was wedged between two roots at the base of a tree, just off the trail, the plastic dulled with dirt. I nearly stepped past it. When I pulled it free, muddy water dripped from the corners. Inside was another note, the paper stained brown along one edge, but still legible. This one was different in tone, less composed. The lines slanted downward as if written while sitting or leaning awkwardly. The apology returned, repeated twice in different words. There was a description of trying to stay quiet, of realizing too late that quiet made things worse. The writer said they had practiced sealing the bags, so their hands would remember how, even when their thoughts would not. The last paragraph was the longest so far. It said the writer believed the trail itself was changing, that distances felt wrong, that the trees did not look the same when approached as they did from far away. It ended with a request, written larger than the rest. Please don't stay still. I lowered the paper and became acutely aware of my posture. I had been frozen in place. 1 foot half shifted forward, my weight uneven. Slowly, deliberately, I moved. The leaves crunched under my boots, the sound impossibly loud. Nothing happened. The forest remained empty. I started walking again, faster now, the notes heavy in my pack. The trail should have looped back toward the service road within another mile. I knew this area. I had walked it before. But after 20 minutes, the terrain did not change the way it should have. The trees thinned, then thickened again. The light dimmed, then brightened, without clear reason. My watch ticked forward, but it felt disconnected from what my body experienced. I found the fourth bag hanging from a trail marker that should not have been there. The post was old, its paint flaking, the symbol faded beyond recognition. I was certain it was not on any map. The bag was tied carefully at eye level, the knot neat and deliberate. Inside was the longest note yet. The writer described sitting down because standing hurt, because moving hurt, because stopping felt like relief. They wrote about realizing that relief was the signal, not the solution. They wrote that every time they paused, the sound came closer. Not footsteps, not breathing, but a pressure in the ears, like being underwater. Halfway through the note, the handwriting changed. The letters became smaller, crowded, as if written quickly. The sentences lost their careful structure. I think it waits for me to notice it. I folded the paper back with shaking hands. When I looked up, the trail behind me did not look the same as it had moments before. The curve was sharper. The trees seemed closer together. I took a step backward, then another, testing whether the world would correct itself. It did not. The radio crackled once more, briefly, and this time I heard a voice. It was not words. Not quite, just a low, uneven sound that rose and fell, as if someone were trying to speak without opening their mouth. I started walking. I did not stop. By the time the light began to shift toward afternoon, I had found 6 bags. Each one confirmed the same thing in different words. The writer was still here when the first note was sealed. They believed time mattered. They believed movement mattered more. And somewhere along the way, without noticing when, I realized that the dampness on the paper had not dried at all. By the time I found the seventh bag, the light had shifted enough that I could no longer pretend the day was behaving normally. The sun was still visible through the trees, but it sat too low, its color washed thin and pale, as if seen through smoke. My watch read 3:14 p.m. I checked it twice, tapping the face to be sure it hadn't frozen. It ticked forward obediently, indifferent to how wrong everything felt. The seventh bag lay directly in the center of the trail, placed flat on the dirt where no one could miss it. I stopped several steps away, my muscles aching from the pace I'd forced myself to keep. My legs trembled, not from fatigue alone, but from the effort of never fully stopping. I had learned to shift my weight constantly, to sway slightly even when reading, terrified of standing still for too long. This note was sealed more carefully than the others. The plastic was doubled, the edges taped. When I opened it, the paper inside was soaked enough that droplets slid down my fingers. The ink had begun to feather, the letters bleeding slightly at the edges, but it was still readable. The writer said they were running out of places to leave the bags, that the trail no longer matched their memory, that they had tried to mark trees, only to lose sight of the markings minutes later. There was a sentence I read 3 times before it settled in my mind. I think it helps me move, as long as I don't stop. The idea hollowed my chest. The implication was clear enough that I didn't need to think it through fully. The writer believed whatever followed them preferred stillness, but tolerated motion, as if movement delayed something inevitable. The note went on to say that the writer had begun sealing the bags while walking, practicing the motion until it became automatic, even when their hands shook too badly to write more than a few lines. Near the bottom, the handwriting wavered. A tear stain warped the paper so badly that the words bent around it. If you are reading this now, it means I finally stopped. I did not look around immediately. I was afraid that if I did, I would confirm something I wasn't ready to face. I folded the paper, resealed it, and placed it carefully back where I had found it. For the first time all day, I left a bag behind. The trail began to slope downward, though it should have been climbing. The ground softened underfoot, the dirt darkening with moisture. I could smell the marsh again, sharp and sour, though I knew I should have passed it long ago. My breathing sounded loud in my ears, each inhale measured, each exhale controlled, afraid that anything too irregular might count as stopping. The 8th bag was not on the trail. I noticed it because of the sound. A faint, irregular tapping, like fingertips brushing plastic. I turned slowly and saw it hanging from a low branch several yards off the path. Swaying gently, though there was still no wind. I approached without breaking stride, circling it so my body never fully stilled. The bag was heavier than the others. Inside was the final note. The paper was almost translucent with moisture. The ink was lighter here, as if the pen had begun to fail. The writer described sitting down, just for a moment, convinced they could stand again quickly. They wrote about the relief of it, the way the ground seemed to accept their weight eagerly. They admitted they had been wrong about time, wrong about distance, wrong about how much control movement really gave them. There is no pace that keeps it away. The note read, There is only motion or noticing. The last lines were cramped into the margin, written so small I had to bring the paper close to my face. It is easier to seal the bag when I'm crying. My hands shake less. I sealed the bag again and tied it back to the branch exactly as I'd found it. My chest hurt now, a tight, aching pressure that made every breath feel insufficient. I wanted to run, but running felt too deliberate, too purposeful, like a decision that could be corrected. Walking had become my only safe state. The sound came then, not from behind me, not from ahead. From everywhere at once, a low, subtle pressure that made my ears ache, like standing too close to a subwoofer. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It felt like awareness made audible, the sensation of being noticed pressing inward from all directions. I did not look. The trees thinned abruptly, opening onto the service road in a way that felt staged, too clean. Gravel crunched under my boots, a sound so familiar it nearly made me cry. My truck sat exactly where I'd left it, the windshield reflecting the dim afternoon light. I crossed the road without slowing, went straight to the driver's door, and only then allowed myself to stop long enough to unlock it. The pressure intensified the moment I stilled. I threw myself into the seat and slammed the door shut. The sound vanished instantly, replaced by the ordinary silence of an idling vehicle. My hands shook so badly, I had to grip the steering wheel with both of them to keep from dropping the keys. I drove without checking the mirrors. At the ranger station, I reported everything. The notes, the bags, the trail behaving incorrectly, the radio interference. Search and rescue was dispatched within the hour. They found the bags, all of them, in the right order, on the correct trail. They did not find a body. The official conclusion was that the notes belonged to a missing hiker, reported 2 days earlier, that the dampness was due to environmental conditions, that stress and isolation had distorted my perception. I was advised to take time off. I did. What I have not been able to explain is this: when I finally opened the first bag again, back home, hours later, the paper inside was still damp, not cool from the air, warm, and pressed faintly into the plastic. On the inside surface were fingerprints that did not match my own, as if someone had been holding the bag from the outside while I walked. My name is Marcus Hale. I am employed as a records technician contracted to assist with inventory and documentation for unresolved missing person cases. My work is administrative by nature. I do not conduct field searches, and I am not trained in investigative procedures beyond cataloging, labeling, and maintaining chain of custody records. On the morning this occurred, I was assigned to process the person offered from a disappearance reported 3 weeks earlier in a protected wilderness area. The assignment was routine. The individual had not been found, but their campsite had been located, and their belongings were transferred to a temporary evidence room inside a ranger substation. Everything that followed took place over the course of a single workday. I arrived shortly before 8:30 a.m. The evidence room was small, windowless, and climate-controlled, designed to prevent moisture damage rather than to accommodate prolonged human presence. Metal shelving lined 3 walls. A folding table sat in the center beneath fluorescent lights that hummed faintly but consistently. I signed the intake log, reviewed the checklist, and began my work. The personal effects consisted of common items: a backpack, boots, a rolled sleeping bag, clothing sealed in plastic, a pocket knife, a notebook, and a few miscellaneous objects collected from the immediate area. Each item had been tagged in the field and required confirmation, description, and photographic documentation. I worked alone, which was typical. Rangers came and went through the day, but the evidence room itself was considered restricted during processing. I started with the larger items. The backpack showed normal wear, dirt consistent with trail use, and no signs of tampering. The boots were heavily worn, soles caked with dried mud. The notebook contained incomplete entries, lists of supplies, distances walked, weather notes. Nothing unusual. By late morning, I had moved on to smaller objects. One item, logged as a personal keepsake, drew my attention only because it lacked detail. It was a smooth, oval stone, roughly the size of a chicken egg. According to the recovery note, it had been found inside the missing person's jacket pocket. There were no markings on it, no obvious significance. I placed it on the table near my right hand, photographed it, and entered a basic description into the system. At 11:42 a.m., I took a break. I left the room to get water, locking the door behind me as required. When I returned 10 minutes later, nothing appeared disturbed. I resumed work where I had left off. At approximately 12:15 p.m., I noticed the stone was closer to the edge of the table than I remembered. At first, I dismissed the observation. I had been moving items, adjusting lighting, leaning across the surface. A small shift was easily explained. I nudged it back toward the center and continued. I finished cataloging the remaining items shortly after 100 p.m. I prepared to pack everything for secure storage. As part of the process, each object had to be weighed. When I reached the stone again, I realized it was no longer where I had placed it. It sat near my left elbow, positioned close enough that my sleeve brushed it when I moved. I stopped working. The table surface was level. There were no vibrations, no drafts. I was certain I had returned the stone to the center earlier. I picked it up, examined it again, and found nothing new. It was dry, room temperature, and unremarkable. I placed it deliberately into a shallow plastic tray on the far side of the table, oriented it flat, and continued with the weighing process. By mid-afternoon, I had completed all required documentation. The items were ready to be sealed and transferred to long-term storage. I began placing them into evidence boxes one by one. The stone was the last object to be packed. When I turned back to the table, the tray was empty. The stone was resting directly in front of me, aligned with the keyboard I had been using to enter data. I stared at it longer than was reasonable, waiting for an explanation to present itself. None did. I checked the tray, the table surface, and the floor beneath. There were no signs of it having rolled. The distance between the tray and the keyboard was over 2 feet, and the path between them was unobstructed but flat. I considered calling a ranger, then decided against it. There was no protocol for reporting a moving object without physical evidence of tampering. I documented the discrepancy in my personal notes instead, careful to keep the official log factual and unembellished. I placed the stone into its evidence bag, sealed it, labeled it, and set it inside the box with the rest of the belongings. I closed the box, applied the tamper seal, and signed off on the transfer. At 4:30 p.m., before leaving for the day, I returned to the evidence room to double-check the seals, a habit I had developed over years of work. Everything appeared intact. The boxes were stacked neatly on the shelf, undisturbed. As I turned to leave, I noticed something on the table. The stone sat there, unbagged, unsealed, positioned near the chair where I had been working. I did not touch it. I checked the shelf immediately. The evidence box remained sealed. The tamper strip was unbroken. The inventory count was correct. There was no indication that the box had been opened or disturbed. I looked back at the table. The stone had not moved, but its presence felt deliberate in a way I found difficult to articulate. I secured the room, signed out for the day, and left the building with the intention of reporting the issue the following morning. I told myself exhaustion was affecting my perception. I told myself I would laugh about it later. That night at home, I found a small, smooth stone on my desk. It was oval, unmarked, and matched the size and shape of the one from the evidence room. I did not bring it with me. I did not sleep that night. I am not using that phrase as a figure of speech or to heighten tension. I lay awake until morning, fully conscious, tracking the passage of hours by the dim change in light outside my apartment window. The stone remained on my desk where I had first seen it. I did not touch it. I did not move it. I positioned my desk lamp so I could see it clearly from the bed, convincing myself that constant observation would somehow keep it fixed in place. It did not move while I watched. At 6:10 a.m., my alarm went off. I sat up immediately and looked at the desk. The stone was no longer centered beneath the lamp. It rested closer to the edge, near the corner closest to the bed. The distance was small, perhaps the width of my thumb, but unmistakable. I stood there for several minutes, measuring the space with my eyes, replaying my memory of where it had been the night before. I was alert enough to know the difference. I wrapped the stone in a paper towel, placed it inside a kitchen drawer, and left for work without breakfast. I arrived at the ranger substation earlier than usual. The building was quiet, lights still dim in the hallways. I signed in, collected the keys, and went directly to the evidence room. I told myself that if the stone was not there, then the explanation was simple stress, fatigue, coincidence. I needed it not to be there. It was there. It sat on the same table as before, positioned almost exactly where I had last seen it the previous afternoon near the chair. It was not inside an evidence bag. It was not listed on the intake log for the day. The boxes I had sealed were still stacked on the shelf, undisturbed. With the stone listed among their contents, I opened the box. The bag labeled for the stone was empty. I closed the box, resealed it, and documented nothing. There was no category for an object that existed in two places simultaneously. I stood in the center of the room and listened. The hum of the lights was unchanged. The air felt cool and dry, the way it always did. Nothing else appeared out of place. I checked my pocket. The paper towel was gone. At 9:00 a.m., a ranger came in to retrieve unrelated equipment. I asked him, casually, whether anyone had accessed the evidence room after hours. He checked the sign-in sheet and shook his head. No entries. No key usage logged. He asked if something was wrong. I told him everything was fine. I returned to my workstation and tried to focus on other tasks, but my attention kept drifting. The stone was not in the evidence room when I checked again at 10:30 a.m. It was not on the shelves, the table, or the floor. I told myself that was good. That was progress. At 11:02 a.m., I felt something press lightly against my ankle. I looked down. The stone rested against the leg of my chair, touching my shoe. It had not been there moments earlier. I had not moved my feet. I pushed my chair back abruptly, standing too quickly, heart racing in a way I found difficult to justify. Several coworkers looked over. I apologized and said I had dropped something. I picked up the stone. For the first time, it felt warm. Not hot. Not unpleasant. Just warm enough to register, as different from the room temperature. I carried it to the evidence room in my bare hand, closed the door behind me, and placed it in the center of the table. I watched it for several minutes, waiting for movement. Nothing happened. I retrieved a clear plastic container with a locking lid, placed the stone inside, and snapped it shut. I added tamper tape, signed and dated it, then placed the container inside a metal drawer and locked it. I wrote the drawer number in my personal notebook. At 12:40 p.m., during lunch, I returned to the evidence room. The container was open. The lid rested beside it. The tamper tape neatly peeled and reattached to the edge of the table. The drawer was unlocked. The stone sat on the floor directly beneath the table, positioned beneath where I normally stood when working. It was closer. I began documenting everything then, not in the official system, but in a private log. Times, distances, placements. I measured how far the stone moved each time. The changes were subtle but consistent, always closer to wherever I spent the most time. Never sudden. Never dramatic. It respected the idea of plausibility in a way that unsettled me more than obvious impossibility would have. By mid-afternoon, the stone no longer waited for me to leave the room. It moved while I worked. I would look down, glance away to type a note, then look back to find it inches nearer. It never crossed into my personal space abruptly. It advanced like something patient, something aware of restraint. At 3:55 p.m., I tried to get rid of it. I placed it in a sealed evidence bag, then inside a locked container, then inside a box, then on the highest shelf. I stepped back and waited. I counted silently, eyes fixed on the shelf. When I reached 60, I felt pressure against my chest. The stone rested in the breast pocket of my shirt. I removed it carefully, hands shaking despite my effort to remain controlled. The warmth was more pronounced now. I set it on the table, backed away, and left the room. I told my supervisor I felt unwell and needed to go home. I did not take the stone with me. When I arrived home, it was waiting on my kitchen counter. I sat down heavily in a chair and stared at it, exhaustion pressing in from all sides. I finally opened the missing persons file I had avoided rereading. I reviewed the field notes, the recovery report, the inventory. At the very end, in a section I had skimmed before, was a handwritten line added by a ranger after the fact. Subject reportedly carried stone at all times. Refused to discard. Stated it didn't like being left behind. I sat at the kitchen table until nightfall, the stone positioned between my hands like an object awaiting instruction. I did not touch it again. I did not need to. Its presence was enough to command my attention without physical contact. The warmth persisted, subtle but constant, like a living body maintaining its own temperature. I became acutely aware of how close it was to me at all times, even when I stepped away. When I moved to the sink, it remained on the table, but the distance between us felt reduced in a way I could not quantify. I tried to reason through it methodically. I reviewed everything I knew about the missing person. He had been experienced, familiar with the terrain, properly equipped. There were no signs of a struggle at the campsite. No blood, no damaged gear, just absence. The stone had been found in his pocket, not listed as something he brought with him, not sourced to the environment around the site. No similar stones were reported nearby. At 7:30 p.m., I placed the stone into a glass bowl and covered it with a heavy lid. I wanted a barrier I could see through, something transparent enough to reassure me that it remained contained. I set the bowl in the center of the living room floor and sat on the couch, eyes fixed on it, notebook in my lap. I wrote down the time, the distance, my position. At 7:46 p.m., a stone was no longer in the bowl. It rested on the couch cushion beside me, close enough that my arm brushed it when I shifted. I stood up immediately, backing away until I reached the far wall. My breathing was controlled, deliberate. Panic would not help. I told myself that fear was a reaction, not a tool. I understood then that containment was not the issue. Proximity was. The stone did not pursue me aggressively. It did not leap, roll, or scrape across surfaces. It simply arrived. Always closer. Always where I had been moments before. It behaved as though distance itself was the obstacle, not the barriers placed in between. I gathered my things and left the apartment. I did not bring the stone with me. I drove aimlessly at first, then with purpose once I realized where I was headed. The ranger substation was closed, but the parking area remained accessible. I parked under a light and sat in the car, hands on the steering wheel, watching the empty passenger seat. At 9:12 p.m., the stone appeared there. I did not scream. I did not react outwardly at all. I simply acknowledged what was happening with a quiet certainty. Avoidance was ineffective. Distance meant nothing. The object did not want to be near me by chance. It was following a pattern. I drove until the roads narrowed and the trees thickened, returning to the outskirts of the protected area where the disappearance had occurred. The place was familiar from maps and reports, even if I had never walked the trails myself. I parked near a closed-access road and stepped out into the cool night air. The forest was quiet in the way only managed land becomes after dark. Controlled, waiting. The stone was in my jacket pocket. I removed it and held it in my palm. The warmth intensified slightly, as if responding to acknowledgement. For the first time, I spoke aloud, asking a question I already suspected I knew the answer to. Is this where you belong? The stone did not move, but the sensation changed. The warmth faded just enough to register as relief. I followed the access road on foot until I reached the area described in the recovery report. I recognized landmarks from photographs: a fallen log, a shallow depression in the ground, a stand of trees bent slightly inward, their growth patterns subtly distorted. I knelt and placed the stone on the earth. It did not return to my hand. I waited. Minutes passed. The night air cooled my skin. The silence remained unbroken. I stood slowly and took a step back. The stone stayed where it was, resting in the dirt, as if it had always been there. I left the area without looking back. When I returned home, the stone was not with me. I searched the apartment anyway, methodically, unable to stop myself. It did not appear. I slept for the first time in nearly 48 hours. The next morning, I submitted my resignation. I cited health concerns. No one argued. I avoided reading any follow-up reports about the case. 3 days later, I received an email from a ranger I recognized. It was brief and factual. A stone matching your description was located at a site during a secondary sweep. Logged and secured. No anomalies observed. I did not reply. I keep my distance from unresolved cases now. I have changed jobs. I avoid places where things go missing without explanation. But I have learned something important from that day. Some personal effects are not remnants. They are anchors. My name is Scott Avery. I am providing this account as a complete and accurate record of events that occurred over the course of a single day, beginning shortly after sunrise and ending well after nightfall. I am 34 years old, employed as a contracted trail surveyor for regional conservation projects, and at the time of this incident, I had no history of psychological illness, substance use, or prior experiences that could reasonably explain what I am about to describe. I am trained to observe terrain changes, note trail degradation, and document irregularities left by human traffic. I entered the forest that morning with the expectation of completing a routine survey and returning before dusk. I did not anticipate leaving with anything else. The trailhead was empty when I arrived. My assignment was simple: walk a decommissioned spur trail that had been closed years earlier due to erosion, document any recent foot traffic, and flag areas requiring maintenance. The forest itself was typical for the region: dense conifers, uneven ground, a narrow path that still existed more by memory than use. The air was cool and still, the kind of morning where sound carries farther than expected. I logged my start time, adjusted my pack, and began walking. Less than a mile in, I noticed the first note. It was written on a scrap of lined paper, folded once, and placed carefully on a flat stone at the edge of the trail. At first I assumed it was litter, maybe something dropped accidentally. Then I saw the handwriting. The words were neat, deliberate, written in black ink that hadn't yet faded. "I'm sorry." That was all it said. There was nothing unusual about a single note like that. People leave odd things in the woods all the time: memorials, prayers, confessions meant for no one. I photographed it, logged its location, and continued on. The trail narrowed, the canopy thickened, and the light shifted as the sun climbed higher. About 15 minutes later, I found another note. This one was pinned to the bark of a tree with a small rusted tack. Same paper, same handwriting. This time it read, "I didn't mean for it to happen." I stopped walking. Two notes might still be coincidence, but the placement felt intentional. The notes weren't discarded. They were positioned where a person walking the trail would see them without effort. I checked the surrounding area for footprints. The ground was soft enough to hold impressions, and there were signs of recent passage. Boot prints, adult size, heading deeper along the same path I was on. I considered turning back. The rational part of my mind suggested that someone had been using the closed trail, possibly camping illegally, possibly unstable. But my job required documentation, and there was no immediate sign of danger. I continued, more alert now, my attention no longer on erosion or vegetation, but on the ground ahead of me. The notes continued. They appeared every few hundred feet. Sometimes they were placed on stones, sometimes taped to fallen branches, sometimes tucked into the crook of a tree. Each one contained an apology. The wording changed, but the tone remained consistent. I should have stopped. I thought no one would notice. I didn't think it would follow. That last one made me pause longer than the others. I read it twice, then a third time, listening to the forest around me. The wind had died down. Birds that had been calling earlier were quiet now. Even my own footsteps sounded louder than they should have. I checked my watch. Late morning. Plenty of time left. I told myself that whoever wrote these notes was likely dealing with guilt, nothing more. People process things in strange ways. The forest often becomes a confessional. Still, I found myself reading each new note more carefully than the last. By early afternoon, the trail had changed. The ground dipped slightly, and the trees grew closer together. Sunlight filtered through in thinner bands, and the air felt heavier, as if it had settled. I realized then that I hadn't heard any wildlife in some time. No insects. No distant birds. Just my breathing and the soft shift of my boots against dirt. The next note was longer. I kept walking because I was afraid to stop. I thought if I stayed ahead of it, everything would be fine. I remember feeling a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with exertion. The boot prints were still there, always ahead of me, never overlapping my own. Whoever had written these apologies was walking the same direction I was, leaving them behind like markers. I called out then, a simple greeting, my voice louder than necessary. It echoed briefly and then vanished, swallowed by the trees. There was no response. The trail curved sharply to the east, and for the first time since I'd entered the forest, my GPS signal wavered. It didn't fail completely, but the accuracy jumped unpredictably. I marked the anomaly and kept moving, telling myself I would reach the turnaround point soon. The notes became more urgent. I shouldn't have brought it here. I didn't know it could learn the trail. I'm sorry if you find this. That line was written in slightly heavier strokes, as if the writer had pressed the pen harder. I stood there for several seconds, staring at the words. A strange thought occurred to me then, quiet and unwelcome. The notes weren't being left for the forest. They were being left for someone walking behind the writer. For me. I considered turning around again, more seriously this time. But something about the situation resisted that idea. The trail behind me felt longer than it should have, less familiar than the ground ahead. That may sound illogical, but it was a strong impression, one that settled into my mind without explanation. I kept going. The forest grew noticeably still as the afternoon wore on. Not gradually, but all at once. I stepped forward and realized that the ambient noise I'd grown accustomed to was simply gone. No wind through needles. No distant movement. Even my own footsteps sounded muted, as if the ground absorbed them. The next note was placed directly in the center of the trail. I can hear it when everything else stops. I did not pick this one up. I did not photograph it. I stood over it, listening, straining to identify any sound that didn't belong to me. There was nothing, and that absence felt deliberate. That was the moment I first understood that the trail was no longer just a path through the forest. It was a sequence, a progression. Each note was not only an apology but a warning, and I was following it step by step, deeper into a place where silence itself seemed to be part of whatever had happened. I checked my watch again. The afternoon was slipping away faster than it should have. I told myself I would reach the end soon, document whatever remained, and leave before dark. I did not yet know that the trail ended somewhere the forest itself refused to make a sound. I continued walking because stopping felt worse. That realization settled in quietly after I stepped past the note in the center of the trail. My body kept moving before my thoughts caught up, as if momentum itself had become a decision. I told myself I was finishing the survey. I told myself the silence was coincidence. The notes were a personal ritual left by someone unraveling, and fear was just my brain trying to impose meaning where none existed. None of that explanation survived very long. The forest ahead looked unchanged at first glance, but subtle differences began to register the longer I walked. The trees were spaced more evenly, their trunks straighter, their lower branches absent, as though trimmed away. The ground was smoother, with fewer fallen needles, fewer rocks. It felt maintained, but not recently, and not by tools I could recognize. Another note waited for me, resting against the base of a tree that hadn't been there before. I know that sentence sounds impossible, so I'll explain it the best way I can. The tree itself was real. Tall, old, with bark split by age, but I was certain I had not passed it earlier. I would have noticed it. There was a distinct bend in its trunk, like a permanent lean, and yet my memory of the last hour of walking contained no such landmark. The note read, "It gets easier to hear once you accept the quiet." I felt an immediate, involuntary urge to cover my ears. Instead, I stood still and listened. Nothing happened. No sound rushed back in. No sudden noise broke the silence. What I noticed instead was pressure, a sensation like standing too close to a large object without touching it. The quiet wasn't empty. It felt occupied. I moved on. The trail no longer showed signs of recent boot prints. That absence concerned me more than their presence ever had. The dirt was undisturbed, smooth in places where footsteps should have been obvious. I checked several times, crouching, brushing aside debris, searching for impressions that simply weren't there. It was as if whoever had walked ahead of me had stopped leaving marks. My radio crackled then, sudden and sharp enough to make me flinch. I lifted it quickly, relief surging at the idea of another, human voice breaking through the isolation. I tried calling in my position, describing the GPS irregularities, requesting confirmation of my last logged waypoint. All I received was static. Not normal static either. It wasn't consistent. It rose and fell in uneven pulses, like breath drawn through a narrow space. I shut the radio off after a few seconds, my hand shaking despite my efforts to steady it. Another note appeared shortly after. I tried the radio too. The handwriting was the same. The placement was careful. The timing felt intentional in a way that made my stomach tighten. I spoke out loud again, my voice sounding thin and out of place in the quiet. I announced who I was, my role, that I wasn't there to interfere, that I just wanted to leave. The words felt foolish the moment they left my mouth, as if I were addressing something that didn't operate on language at all. The forest did not respond. By mid-afternoon, the light had begun to shift in a way that suggested approaching evening, though my watch insisted it was still early. Shadows stretched too long, too quickly, and the canopy seemed to dim without any corresponding movement of the sun. I found another note, longer this time, folded twice and weighted down with a stone. I thought the silence was just fear at first. I thought it was my ears, my head. Then I realized the forest wasn't quiet. It was listening. I did not finish reading it immediately. My eyes kept lifting from the page, scanning the trees, the trail. The spaces between trunks where depth became difficult to judge. I had the distinct impression of being observed, not from any specific direction, but from the environment itself. I forced myself to finish the note. When I stopped making noise, it came closer. I began walking faster. The trail sloped downward, leading into a shallow basin where the trees grew even closer together. The air felt cooler there, heavier, carrying the faint scent of damp earth. My breathing sounded wrong to my own ears, too loud, too intrusive, and I found myself unconsciously trying to quiet it. That was when I noticed something else. My pack no longer creaked when I moved. The usual soft noises, fabric shifting, gear knocking lightly, were gone. I stopped abruptly and shook my shoulder, expecting at least some sound. There was nothing. Panic threatened then, sharp and sudden. I clapped my hands once, hard, the sound echoing faintly before vanishing. The silence rushed back immediately, thicker than before, pressing in from all sides. Another note lay ahead, this one torn unevenly, as if ripped in haste. I shouldn't have tested it. I did not slow down after that. I did not stop to document or photograph anything else. My professional instincts were gone, replaced by a single overriding goal: reach the end of the trail, turn around, and get out. The forest did not make that easy. The path narrowed until my shoulders brushed against branches that did not rustle when touched. Leaves bent without sound. Twigs snapped without noise. It was as if every physical reaction had been stripped of its audible consequence. I stumbled once, catching myself against a tree. My breath hitched, and in that momentary pause, I felt it again. That sense of proximity, of something close enough to be aware of my movements without revealing itself. The next note was written in a hurried scrawl, the neat handwriting finally breaking down. It knows when you rush. I stopped. I stood there, heart pounding, aware of every movement my body wanted to make and every sound it might produce. I understood then, with terrible clarity, that the trail was no longer just leading me somewhere. It was teaching me something. The forest ahead was darker now, the light thinning, as if absorbed by the trees themselves. I could no longer see the end of the path, only its continuation into shadow. Another note waited at the edge of that darkness. I'm sorry I led you this far. I did not pick it up. I did not read it again. I knew, without needing confirmation, that whatever had followed the writer had not stopped. And as the forest around me fell into complete, unnatural silence, I realized that I could no longer hear my own footsteps at all. I slowed my breathing and took one careful step forward. There was no sound. That absence was no longer surprising, but it was still wrong in a way that made my skin prickle. I watched my boot press into the dirt, saw soil compress and shift, saw small stones roll aside, and heard nothing. The world had not gone deaf. It had chosen silence. The trail ahead descended gently, and then leveled out into a small clearing I did not remember from any map or satellite imagery I had reviewed before taking this assignment. The trees formed a near-perfect ring around it, their trunks evenly spaced, their branches arching inward, just enough to blot what little light remained. The ground was bare, stripped of undergrowth, pine needles, pressed flat as if by repeated passage. At the center of the clearing stood a single wooden stake driven into the earth. Another note was tied to it with fraying twine. I stood at the edge of the clearing for a long time, trying to convince myself not to walk forward. Every instinct I had told me this was the end of something, though I didn't yet understand what. Turning around felt possible in theory, but impossible in practice, like trying to step away from the edge of a cliff while already leaning forward. I approached the stake. The note was longer than any of the others, written on multiple pieces of paper taped together. The handwriting had regained some of its earlier neatness, as if the writer had forced calm onto themselves. For this final message, I stopped here, because this is where the forest stops responding. Past this point, it doesn't echo. It doesn't carry sound. It doesn't give anything back. I swallowed and kept reading. I think it learned me by listening. Every step, every breath, every mistake. When I tried to be quiet, it learned quiet. When I panicked, it learned how panic moves. My hands trembled slightly as I held the pages steady. I thought if I apologized enough, if I marked the path, someone might understand what I did wrong and avoid it. But I realize now that the trail doesn't warn people. It brings them. The final line was written separately, lower on the page, in darker ink. I'm sorry it knows you're here. The moment I finished reading, the pressure I'd felt all afternoon intensified. It was no longer vague or distant. It felt close. Close enough that my body reacted before my mind did. A deep instinctive recognition that something occupied the same space I did, separated only by an invisible boundary. I backed away from the stake. The clearing remained perfectly still. No movement, no sound. But the sensation of being observed sharpened, narrowing, as if my position had been confirmed. I turned and ran. At least, I tried to. My legs moved. I could see them pumping beneath me, feel muscles straining, lungs burning. But the distance between myself and the trees of the edge of the clearing did not close the way it should have. Each step felt slightly delayed, as if the ground resisted being left behind. Panic surged, and with it came noise. My breath tearing in and out of my chest. The thud of my heartbeat in my ears. For the first time since entering the clearing, I heard something else. A sound behind me. It was subtle. Not a footstep. Not breathing. It was the absence of space, the feeling of something adjusting to my movement, matching it without effort. I did not look back. I knew instinctively that acknowledging it would make it closer. I forced myself to slow down. The note had warned me. It knew when you rush. I shortened my stride, controlled my breathing, moved deliberately instead of frantically. The resistance lessened. The trees at the edge of the clearing began to draw nearer. The presence behind me did not retreat. It followed at a consistent distance, as if distance itself were a concept it understood better than I did. The moment I stepped out of the clearing, sound returned. Not all at once. First, the faint whisper of air through branches. Then the soft crunch of dirt beneath my boots. Then, like a wave breaking, the forest's usual background noise rushed back in. Birds, insects, distant movement. I nearly collapsed from the sudden overload. I did not stop. I walked fast, but not fast enough to panic. I kept my movement steady, my breathing even, remembering every warning I had read. The trail looked the same as it had earlier, but I no longer trusted my sense of distance or time. I focused on motion, on continuity, on leaving one footfall behind before committing to the next. The pressure eased gradually. I did not feel it vanish. It faded the way a headache fades, slowly enough that you only notice its absence once it's gone. When I finally reached a familiar bend in the trail, the one I remembered from the morning, I allowed myself to believe I might make it out. My GPS stabilized. My radio crackled once and then settled into normal static. I did not speak into it. I emerged at the trailhead just before nightfall. The sky was deepening toward blue, the first stars beginning to show. The parking area was still empty. My truck sat where I had left it, untouched. Only when I closed the door behind me did my hands begin to shake uncontrollably. I reported the incident that night. I documented the notes, the GPS anomalies, the radio interference. I described the clearing as best I could without sounding unhinged. The report was filed, reviewed, and ultimately classified as an unverified environmental anomaly combined with personal stress response. The trail was officially closed again 2 weeks later, this time permanently. I returned once, months after the incident, standing at the trailhead without stepping inside. A new sign had been installed, warning of unstable terrain and hazardous conditions. There was no mention of silence, no mention of notes. At the base of the sign, placed carefully on a flat stone, rested a scrap of lined paper. I did not touch it. I did not read it. I left, because I understood now what the apologies were really for. They weren't asking forgiveness for what happened in the forest. They were apologies for leading someone else close enough to be heard. My name is Ian Fletcher. I am a geospatial data analyst by profession. Contracted part-time with regional search and rescue teams to interpret GPS telemetry recovered from personal devices. My work is procedural, technical, and normally unemotional. Coordinates arrive as strings of numbers. I plot them, identify drift, signal decay, battery behavior, and hand my conclusions to field teams. I do not speculate. I do not editorialize. What I am about to describe happened over the course of a single day, and it is the only time in my career I have documented something that does not fit within any existing explanation. The request came in just after sunrise. A solo camper had gone missing overnight in a managed wilderness area that allows limited backcountry access. His phone had stopped responding to voice calls, but continued emitting intermittent GPS pings before finally going dark. The search coordinator forwarded me a compressed file containing raw location data extracted from the carrier's emergency access portal. This was not unusual. Devices often continue submitting positional packets, even when other functions fail. My task was to reconstruct movement patterns from those pings and determine the most probable last known location. I downloaded the file, verified its checksum, and opened it in my decoding environment. At first glance, the data looked corrupted. Instead of the familiar latitude and longitude pairs, the coordinate fields contained alphabetic characters. That can happen if a file header is misaligned or if a parsing script is pointed at the wrong delimiter. I reloaded the raw data and opened it as plain text. The characters remained. Each GPS ping, timestamped to the second, showed 2 fields where coordinates should be. Those fields contained short sequences of capital letters. 4 or 5 characters per field, consistent length, no symbols. No numbers, I assumed encoding. Some proprietary compression scheme, perhaps. I ran the data through standard decoders base 64. ASCII offsets hex interpretation. Nothing produced numeric output. I checked the timestamps next. They were sequential, occurring every 90 seconds for just under 4 hours. Battery decay aligned with that interval. Everything about the telemetry timing was normal. Only the payload was wrong. I copied the first 10 pings into a spreadsheet and aligned the letter sequences side by side. When viewed vertically, the characters formed words. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. I do not mean that figuratively. I checked the clock on my desk. 7 minutes had passed without me moving. The words were simple. Plain English, no slang. No abbreviations. Each GPS ping produced 2 words. One where latitude should be, one where latitude should be. Read together, in order, they formed a sentence. I told myself it was coincidence. Pareidolia. Humans are good at seeing patterns where none exist. I rearranged the data, shuffled rows, removed timestamps. The sentence only appeared when the pings were ordered exactly as recorded. I pulled the raw carrier log again, to verify there had been no intermediary system rewriting the payload. There hadn't. The sentence was incomplete, stopping abruptly at the final ping. It did not include the camper's name. It did not include coordinates. It read like a statement, not a message intended for rescue. I will not repeat the wording here yet. At the time, I convinced myself it was the result of a rare firmware malfunction, some debug string bleeding into the GPS buffer. That explanation made me uncomfortable, but it was still an explanation. I notified the search coordinator that the data appeared corrupted and requested any additional telemetry from the device. While waiting, I attempted to map the words spatially, treating each letter as a numerical offset, hoping to recover a location. That produced nothing useful. The words did not translate cleanly into distances or bearings. They resisted interpretation in any form except literal language. Late morning, a second file arrived. The coordinator said it had just been recovered from a relay cache that sometimes delays packets. These pings occurred after the original sequence ended. Only 6 of them. Same interval, same format, more words. When appended to the first set, the sentence continued. This time, I felt a physical reaction. My hands went cold. The words were not random. They described movement. Not coordinates, but actions. Directions without distances. References to terrain features that would not appear on any standard map. The sentence now ended with what could only be read as a warning. I stood up and walked away from my desk. I needed air. I reminded myself that I had not slept well the night before, that stress primes the brain to misinterpret information. When I returned, I printed the data on paper. Ink has a way of grounding things. The words did not change. I called the coordinator and told him, carefully, that the GPS data did not contain usable coordinates, but might still indicate a general search area, if cross-referenced with the camper's planned route. He asked me to email what I had. I hesitated before sending the file, not because it was unprofessional, but because I could not explain what it showed without sounding irrational. He called me back less than 5 minutes later. He did not ask how the data could do what it was doing. He asked me if I thought the camper was still alive. I did not answer immediately. The words did not explicitly state anything about survival. They implied awareness. They implied observation. They implied that the device was not malfunctioning randomly, but responding to something happening in real time. I told him I could not assess survivability from corrupted telemetry. That was true in the narrowest sense. By early afternoon, I was no longer working on assignment. I was reading the sentence over and over, trying to identify intent. I removed the timestamps and read it as prose. I added them back and watched how the language changed as battery life declined, the words becoming shorter, simpler, as if conserving energy. The final ping was the most troubling. It consisted of a single word in each field. Together, they formed a location description that could not exist in GPS terms, but immediately conjured a mental image. I realized then that the sentence was not meant for me or for search and rescue. It was describing where the camper was, not in space, but in relation to something else. As dusk approached, I received one more message from the coordinator. The search team had found the camper's tank. It was intact, no signs of struggle, no footprints leading away. His phone was not there. I looked back at the printed page on my desk and understood, with a clarity I had not felt all day, that the GPS pings had stopped not because the device failed, but because it had reached the end of whatever it was describing. I archived the files before midnight, as required. I labeled them as unrecoverable data due to payload corruption. That is what the report says. What it does not say is that I kept a copy. I still have it. I have not decoded it again. I am writing this now because I noticed some this morning when I opened the file to confirm the word count. There are more pings than there were yesterday. I reopened the file with the intention of proving myself wrong. That was my stated goal, at least. In reality, I needed to know whether the additional pings I thought I saw were real or the product of exhaustion. The clock on my monitor read 12:41 a.m. The entire incident, from first download to archiving, was still well within a single calendar day. And that detail mattered to me more than it should have. The file timestamp showed it had not been modified since I closed it the night before. Same checksum, same metadata. Yet when I scrolled past the final recorded ping, there were new entries. 7 of them. All time stamped after the battery should have been fully depleted. The intervals were no longer consistent. 90 seconds became irregular gaps. 11 minutes, 3 minutes, 40 seconds, nearly an hour. That alone suggested the data could not be genuine GPS telemetry. A phone with a dead battery cannot resume transmission sporadically. I checked system logs to see if I had accidentally merged files. I had not. The payloads followed the same pattern as before. 2 fields, capital letters, short words. When placed in order, they extended the original sentence. The tone changed. The earlier pings described movement and surroundings in a detached way, almost observational. These new lines felt reactive. The language tightened. Articles disappeared. Verbs became imperative. Whatever the device was doing, it was no longer describing a situation. It was responding to one. I forced myself to analyze the data as data. I plotted the timestamps against the battery decay curve from the first set of pings. The new transmissions ignored it entirely. According to carrier diagnostics embedded in the header, the phone was offline, unpowered, and unreachable. The GPS subsystem should not have been capable of generating anything. I considered the possibility of spoofed data. Someone injecting packets into the carrier system. That theory fell apart when I examined the routing signatures. These pings originated from the same device ID, authenticated through the same emergency access handshake as the original set. To fake that would require access at a level far beyond a prank or intrusion. It would also require knowing exactly how the earlier corrupted payloads were structured, including their linguistic pattern. I printed the new pings and placed them beneath the original pages on my desk. Read together. The sentence now described a pause, a period of stillness, then awareness of being observed. I stopped reading after that line. I felt a pressure behind my eyes, the kind that precedes a migraine. I closed my laptop and sat in silence, listening to the ambient hum of my apartment. Every rational explanation I tried to assemble failed under even minimal scrutiny. I reminded myself that stress can create narrative where none exists, that the human brain seeks continuity. But the continuity was already there, embedded in the data before I noticed it. At 10:13 a.m., my phone rang. The caller ID showed the search coordinator's number. I did not answer immediately. When I did, he sounded exhausted. The team had expanded their search radius after failing to find tracks beyond the campsite. Thermal imaging drones detected nothing. Wildlife cameras in the area showed no movement consistent with a person leaving on foot. He asked me, quietly, if I had found anything new in the data. I told him yes, that there were additional pings. I did not tell him what they said. There was a long pause on the line. He asked me to email them. I said I would need time to verify authenticity. That was a lie, but it bought me a few hours. After the call ended, I compared the language of the new pings to the old ones at a structural level. Sentence length, word choice, frequency of pronouns. There was a shift. The earlier text avoided first-person references. The new editions did not. They did not use names, but they acknowledged presence in a way that implied perspective. I tried to treat the words as if they were coordinates again, mapping letter positions to numerical values. This time, something unexpected happened. When I plotted them sequentially, they formed a rough shape. Not a path, a boundary. A closed loop that did not correspond to any terrain feature, but did suggest enclosure. I checked maps of the area where the camper disappeared. There was no structure, natural or man-made, that matched the dimensions implied by the plot. But the shape did align with something else. The maximum error radius of the original GPS lock before corruption began. As if the device had stopped reporting where it was and started reporting where it could not leave. Near dawn, I received an automated system notification. Carrier diagnostic update. A new packet associated with the same device ID had been logged. This one did not contain GPS data at all. It was flagged as malformed and quarantined automatically. I accessed it using my credentials before it could be purged. It contained only one field. No coordinates. No timestamps embedded in the payload. Just a single word. It was the same word repeated twice, once where latitude should be, once where longitude should be. When read aloud, it sounded less like information and more like insistence. I sent the coordinator the original additional pings, but withheld the final packet. That decision still weighs on me. Within an hour, he replied that the words matched, disturbingly well, with a feature described in a missing persons case from several years earlier in the same region. A hiker who vanished without trace after reporting that his GPS was telling him things. By late morning, the search was officially suspended. Weather conditions deteriorated, and there was no new actionable intelligence. The camper was reclassified from missing to presumed deceased, pending further evidence. I closed the file again, this time disconnecting my machine from the network before doing so. The day should have ended there. It did not. At 5:46 p.m., well before sunset, I opened the file one last time. I told myself it was to ensure nothing else had changed. There were no new pings. But one of the earlier words was different. Just one letter altered. Subtle enough that I would not have noticed if I had not read the sentence dozens of times. The change transformed a description into a directive. That was when I understood that the GPS data was no longer recording what had happened to the camper. It was recording what was happening to whoever was reading it. I disconnected my computer from the internet before I read the sentence again. That detail matters, because I need you to understand that nothing I am about to describe depended on an active connection, an external update, or any system that could plausibly be blamed for interference. The machine was isolated. Power only. Local files only. I read the sentence from the beginning, slowly out loud. I wanted to hear whether the change I had noticed altered the cadence, the meaning, the intent. Spoken aloud, the words no longer sounded like a record. They sounded instructional. Not commands exactly, but suggestions phrased with unsettling confidence. as if the outcome was already known. The altered word redirected the focus. Before, the sentence described observation from an unspecified vantage point. Now it implied proximity, nearness without distance, presence without position. I scrolled back to the timestamps. The moment that word changed did not correspond to any new ping being added. There was no insertion, no appended data. The modification had occurred retroactively, inside a packet that had already existed for hours. The file hash changed only after I opened it. I verified that twice. I closed the document and leaned back in my chair, suddenly aware of how quiet my apartment was. The building sits near a main road. There is always traffic noise. That evening, there was none. I checked the window. Cars were moving normally. Sound had not disappeared. It had simply failed to reach me. I did not reopen the file right away. Instead, I wrote down the full sentence from memory on a legal pad, including the original wording as I remembered it. When I compared it to the on-screen version later, I realized I had unconsciously corrected it. I had written what it used to say, not what it said now. That realization frightened me more than the words themselves. At 6:30 p.m., my phone vibrated with a text from an unknown number. The message contained no greeting, no context. Just 4 words separated by spaces, all in capital letters. They matched the next 4 GPS pings that should not have existed. I did not reply. I blocked the number. Within seconds, another text arrived from a different number. Same words, same order. I turned the phone off and removed the battery. When I set it down, the legal pad slid slightly across my desk, as if nudged. I had not touched it. I told myself I was tired, that I had been immersed in anomalous data for too long. That stress can manifest physically. That explanation did nothing to slow my breathing. I reopened the file. There were 3 new pings. They were time-stamped in the future. Not far. Minutes ahead. The first timestamp was less than 60 seconds from the current time. I watched the system clock roll forward. When it matched the timestamp exactly, the corresponding words changed. They did not appear. They changed, as if they had always been there, and were only now becoming legible. The sentence no longer described terrain or movement. It described orientation. It referenced up and down without elevation, inside and outside without enclosure. Then it did something I had not seen before. It addressed me directly, not by name, by function. The words identified the act of reading as a location. I stood up, knocking my chair over. The sound echoed too loudly, then cut off abruptly, like a recording stopped mid-playback. My laptop screen flickered once. Not from power fluctuation but from refresh, as if the display had been redrawn. The next ping arrived. The words suggested that the camper had not been lost in the conventional sense. He had not wandered off trail. He had not fallen. He had followed something that could not be plotted, because it did not exist until it was perceived. The GPS device, in trying to reconcile an impossible position, had done the only thing it could. It had described the experience instead of the place. I understood then why the pings formed a loop, why the sentence resisted conversion into coordinates, why the battery logic had failed. The device had stopped tracking movement through space and started tracking progression through attention. Every time the data was read, interpreted, or mapped, the sequence advanced. I closed the file again, harder this time, as if force might matter. The room felt smaller. Not physically, but perceptually, like depth cues were being flattened. I could see everything, but nothing felt distant. At 7:02 p.m., The final ping arrived. There was no timestamp attached. The payload consisted of 2 identical words. I will not write them here. What I can say is that they were not threatening. They were not warnings. They were acknowledgments. I deleted the file. I did not move it to the recycle bin. I overwrote it. Multiple passes. I wiped the drive partition it had been stored on. I shut the computer down and did not turn it back on. The sense of enclosure did not fade. An hour later, there was a knock at my door. I did not answer. I stood in the hallway listening. There was no second knock. No footsteps retreating. Just the certainty that something was on the other side, waiting for confirmation that I was still oriented toward it. Eventually, the pressure eased. Not gone. Just less immediate. I slept poorly, waking often with the sensation that I had been interrupted mid-thought. In the morning, the sun came up normally. Sound returned to its usual volume. My phone worked again after I reassembled it. There were no new messages. No missed calls. The search coordinator emailed me shortly after 9:00 a.m. The camper's phone had been recovered overnight. It was found inside the tent. Fully charged. The GPS module was physically damaged, crushed inward as if by pressure applied from all directions at once. There was no sign of impact. No debris. No explanation. The coordinator asked if I wanted to review the device data directly. I declined. I resigned from my contract that afternoon. I am writing this because I need to put the sequence somewhere that is not a file, not a screen, not a set of symbols that can be revisited and advanced. Words on paper feel safer, even though I know that is probably an illusion. If you are reading this and thinking about the sentence, wondering what it said, trying to imagine the missing words, stop. Do not attempt to reconstruct it. Do not look for patterns. Because the last thing the GPS ever recorded was not where the camper was. It was where the attention settled. And it does not like being left unread. My name is Andrew Collins. I have been a ranger for 12 years. Long enough that the rules of the park stopped feeling like text and started feeling like instinct. They were drilled into me during training, repeated during briefings, printed on laminated cards, and eventually memorized so completely that I could recite entire sections without thinking. Wildlife encounters, lost hikers, flash floods, backcountry injuries, radio protocol, evacuation thresholds. I knew them the way other people knew prayers. That familiarity was why the letter unsettled me so deeply. It should not have been there. It could not have been there. And yet, when I opened the rulebook that afternoon, it was waiting for me, folded neatly between pages I had read 100 times before. The day began without anything that felt unusual at the time. I arrived at the ranger station just before dawn, signed in, poured burnt coffee into a chipped mug, and checked the incident log from the night shift. No emergencies, no weather alerts, no missing persons. The forecast was clear and dry. The kind of late season calm that made the forest seem cooperative. I remember thinking it might be a quiet day, the kind you appreciate more as you get older. I was assigned routine patrol along the eastern trails, a loop I had walked so often that my boots seemed to follow it on their own. Before heading out, I grabbed the standard ranger rulebook from my locker. I didn't need it. I never did. But habit is a powerful thing. And I liked the weight of it in my pack, the reassurance of procedures and structure. The cover was scuffed, the binding creased from years of use. It was the same book I had been issued when I transferred to this park, the same one I had annotated lightly, in pencil during my first year. I knew every page. That certainty mattered later. The patrol itself was uneventful. I checked trail markers, cleared a small fallen branch, reminded a pair of hikers about food storage. Around midday, I returned to the station to log my notes and eat lunch. That was when I noticed something wrong with the book. I opened it to the section on lost person protocols. More out of muscle memory than necessity, and the pages didn't separate the way they should have. There was resistance, a slight unevenness, as if something thin but solid had been placed between them. At first, I assumed a pamphlet, or an old note had slipped in without my noticing. When I pulled it free, what unfolded in my hands was a single sheet of paper, folded twice, edges worn soft, as if it had been handled many times. It wasn't official park paper. No letterhead, no watermark. Just plain white, faintly yellowed, with writing on one side. My handwriting recognition kicked in immediately, the same way it does when you review incident reports. This wasn't mine. The letters were careful but strained, each lineful pressed slightly too hard into the page, as though the writer had been fighting trembling hands. For a moment, I didn't read it. I stared at the blank back of the sheet, aware of an odd pressure building behind my eyes. I remember thinking, very clearly, that this didn't belong to me, and that I should put it back, pretend I hadn't seen it. But the rules I lived by had always told me to document, to investigate, to never ignore anomalies. So I turned it over. Andrew, it began. Seeing my name written there made my stomach tighten. It wasn't the casual address of a coworker or friend. There was no greeting beyond that single word. The next line sat too close beneath it, as if the writer hadn't trusted themselves to leave space. If you are reading this, it means you finally opened the book, instead of carrying it like a charm. I felt a chill then, a subtle one, but enough that I noticed. I had the distinct impression of being observed, though the station was empty and quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator in the corner. I read on. I know you believe you know every rule in that manual. You do. That's why this had to be hidden there. You wouldn't look anywhere else. The letter went on to apologize. Not in broad terms, but with specificity that made my throat dry. It apologized for the radio checks I never heard, for the footprints I dismissed as animal sign, for the way the forest seemed to close in on certain trails without warning. It referenced decisions I remembered making, moments where I had followed protocol, and still felt afterward that something hadn't been right. About halfway down the page, the tone shifted. The apologies gave way to instructions, written in the same careful hand. Do not report this. Do not make a copy. Do not tell anyone you found it. I laughed once, a short, humorless sound. Someone was playing a cruel joke, I told myself. Maybe a disgruntled former ranger, maybe an elaborate prank. But even as I tried to rationalize it, my eyes kept moving, drawn by a sense of obligation I couldn't quite explain. It warned me not to stay after dark. Not just that night, but any night after I read the letter. It told me to avoid the eastern trails, the same ones I had patrolled that morning. It told me that the rules we memorized were incomplete by design, that some omissions were intentional, meant to keep rangers functional rather than safe. The final paragraph was the worst. I am sorry to leave this for you. I am sorry that knowing makes it harder. But I am more sorry for what happens if you keep pretending the book is whole. The letter ended with a signature I didn't recognize, just initials, pressed so hard into the page that the paper had almost torn. I sat there for a long time after finishing it, the paper resting on the desk in front of me. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second louder than the last. Eventually, I folded the letter back along its creases and slid it into my pocket. I didn't know why I didn't throw it away. Part of me felt that doing so would be a kind of violation, as if the letter had chosen me and would not accept being discarded. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze. I completed my paperwork, responded to a minor call about a twisted ankle, and avoided looking at the rulebook in my pack. Every time my radio crackled, I flinched, half expecting a voice to address me by name. Nothing did. The forest remained calm, almost deceptively so. As the sun began to sink, painting long shadows between the trees, I made a decision that felt both foolish and inevitable. Before leaving for the day, I took the rule book back out and flipped through it carefully, page by page, searching for any sign that the letter had altered something else. The text was unchanged. The margins were empty. But the certainty I had carried for years, the belief that I knew this book completely, was gone. When I locked the station and started toward my truck, the weight of the folded letter in my pocket felt heavier than any gear I carried. The sky darkened faster than I expected, and the forest seemed to lean closer, as if listening. For the first time in my career, I found myself wishing I had ignored the rules, wishing I had left the book behind, unopened, and never learned what someone else had hidden inside it for me. I drove away from the station, with the letter still in my pocket, telling myself I would read it again once I got home, in better light, with a clearer head. That plan unraveled almost immediately. Less than 5 minutes down the access road, I pulled over, killed the engine, and sat there listening to the ticking of cooling metal. The forest pressed in on both sides of the road, darkening fast. I took the letter out and unfolded it again, needing to confirm it hadn't changed, that I hadn't imagined any of it. It was the same. The same careful handwriting. The same apologies. The same warning that the rulebook was incomplete by design. I read it slowly this time, line by line, forcing myself to breathe evenly. I noticed details I had missed before. Certain phrases were underlined, not for emphasis but for correction, as if the writer had rewritten the sentence multiple times and settled reluctantly on what remained. There were faint impressions on the paper, where other words had been pressed and erased, hard enough to scar the fibers. I tried to angle it toward the fading light, but whatever those earlier drafts had said was gone. When I finally folded it again, my hands were steady. That disturbed me more than if they had been shaking. At home, I locked the door behind me and placed the letter on the kitchen table, smoothing it flat like evidence. I poured a glass of water I didn't drink and sat across from it, replaying the day in my head. I tried to remember when the rulebook had last left my possession. The answer was never. It stayed in my locker or my pack. No one had access to it without my knowledge. That realization closed off another line of rational explanation. I slept poorly. Every time I drifted off, I dreamed of pages turning on their own, of rules rearranging themselves just out of sight. I woke before dawn with the sensation that I had missed a radio call, my heart racing, my room silent. The letter lay where I had left it. Nothing had moved. By the time I returned to the station, the sun was up. and the routine of the place exerted its familiar pressure. Morning check, INS equipment inspections, brief conversations about trail conditions. I almost managed to convince myself the letter was a one-off, an anomaly I could document later. Then I opened my locker. The rulebook sat on the shelf exactly where I had placed it, but it was thicker than it should have been. I stared at it for a long moment before reaching out. When I picked it up, I felt the difference immediately, a subtle resistance in the binding. My pulse quickened. Slowly, deliberately, I opened it to the same section as the day before. The letter was gone. In its place was a new page. It matched the rest of the book perfectly. Same paperweight, same font, same formatting. If I hadn't known the text by heart, I might not have noticed anything wrong at all. But I did know it, and what I was reading did not belong there. The section heading was unchanged. The procedures beneath it were familiar, up to a point. Then, without warning, an additional paragraph appeared, seamlessly integrated into the layout. If the subject responds to auditory stimuli, not originating from confirmed sources, do not acknowledge the response. Proceed as if no communication has occurred. My mouth went dry. That sentence had never been there. I was absolutely certain of it. I read on. Do not use the subject's name, even if the subject uses yours. Names establish continuity. I closed the book, my hands suddenly unsteady. Around me, the station carried on as usual. A ranger laughed down the hall. A radio crackled with a routine weather update. No one else seemed to notice anything wrong. I opened the book again. The added text remained. For the next several hours, I tested my sanity in small, careful ways. I cross-referenced the rulebook against the digital version stored on the station computer. The added paragraph did not exist there. I checked an older printed copy kept in storage. It matched the digital file, not mine. Only my book contained the new text. I considered reporting it. The thought brought an immediate, visceral wave of resistance, as if my body itself rejected the idea. The letter's instructions echoed in my mind, not as words but as a feeling of impending consequence. Against my better judgment, I complied. The first incident happened shortly after noon. I was patrolling a short connector trail near the eastern section, despite the letter's warning. I told myself that avoiding it outright would be an overreaction, that daylight eliminated most risks. About halfway down the trail, I heard my name. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't whispered. It was spoken at normal volume, calmly, from somewhere just off the path. Andrew. I stopped walking. My training urged me to respond, to identify myself, to establish contact. The new paragraph from the rulebook surfaced in my mind with startling clarity. Do not acknowledge the response. I stood still, staring ahead, my heart hammering. After a few seconds, I took another step forward, then another, deliberately ignoring the sound. Behind me, I heard movement. The careful placement of footsteps that matched my pace. Andrew, the voice said again, closer now. I kept walking. The trail opened into a small clearing, sunlight filtering through the canopy. As I stepped into it, the footsteps stopped. The forest fell silent in a way that felt unnatural, as if sound itself had been dampened. I waited, every sense straining. Nothing happened. When I finally turned around, the trail behind me was empty. I returned to the station shaken but intact. I didn't write the incident down. I couldn't bring myself to commit it to paper. Instead, I retrieved the rulebook and flipped back to the altered section. Another sentence had appeared beneath the last, the ink still crisp. Compliance improves survivability. I snapped the book shut and locked it in my locker, my hands slick with sweat. The realization settled over me slowly, heavy and undeniable. The letter hadn't been a warning about the rulebook. It had been a warning about me. Someone before me had learned these additions the hard way. They had left the letter as a kind of inheritance, a confession and an apology bound up together. And now, in ways I didn't yet understand, the rules were updating themselves around my behavior, adapting in real time. As evening approached, the unease deepened. The forest outside the station looked the same as it always had, but I no longer trusted its familiarity. I checked the time repeatedly, counting the hours until I could leave. The letter had said not to stay after dark. For the first time since I became a ranger, I planned my departure with urgency rather than obligation. When the sun dipped below the tree line, my radio crackled. "Andrew," a voice said, clear and unmistakably close, though the radio display showed no incoming transmission. I froze, my hand hovering over the volume knob. The rulebook sat locked away, but its presence felt inescapable, like a second set of eyes. "Andrew," the voice repeated, patient this time. I didn't respond. I shut the radio off completely and sat there in the growing darkness, listening to my own breathing, wondering how many more rules were waiting to be written and what it would cost me to keep following them. I left the station before full dark, earlier than protocol required, earlier than I ever had in my career. I logged my departure time with a vague note about fatigue and drove away without looking back. The radio stayed off. The rulebook remained locked in my locker, but its absence didn't bring relief. I could feel it anyway, like a missing tooth you keep touching with your tongue. Halfway home, the sense of being followed returned. Not visually, not audibly, but as pressure, the same awareness you get when someone stands just outside your field of view. I didn't slow down. I didn't pull over. I drove straight to my house and locked myself inside, every light on, every blind drawn. Sleep was impossible. Each time I closed my eyes, I pictured blank pages filling themselves with text, rules being written, because of things I had already done, things I might do next. Sometime after midnight, my phone vibrated on the nightstand. No sound, just a single alert. Unknown number. I didn't answer it. I turned the phone face down and waited for it to stop. It didn't ring again. When I checked it in the morning, there was no missed call. No notification, nothing to prove it had happened at all. I called in sick the next day. That alone felt like a violation, a deviation from the patterns that had defined my life for years. I spent the morning going over the letter again, memorizing it the way I had memorized the rules, searching for something I had missed. One sentence stood out now, sharper than before. Some omissions are intentional, meant to keep rangers functional rather than safe. By midday, I understood what that meant. I couldn't stay away. Avoidance felt like another kind of non-compliance, and the letter had never suggested that ignorance would protect me. Against every instinct screaming for distance, I drove back to the station. The parking lot was empty when I arrived. No vehicles. No voices. Just the wind threading through the trees. Inside, the lights were on, but the place felt hollowed out, as if everyone had stepped away at once. I went straight to my locker and unlocked it. The rulebook was there, thicker still. My hands trembled as I opened it. Entire new sections had appeared, integrated seamlessly among the originals. They weren't labeled as additions. They didn't announce themselves. They simply existed, written with the same authority as the rules I had trusted for years. One described procedures for encounters that left no physical evidence. Another outlined response hierarchies when multiple auditory sources used the same voice. A third warned against correcting inaccuracies in reports, stating that consistency mattered more than truth. Near the back of the book, where appendices used to be, I found something that made me sit down hard on the bench. A resignation notice. It wasn't signed. It wasn't dated. It wasn't addressed to anyone specific. But it used my name, my title, my station. It stated that I was leaving the service effective immediately, citing personal reasons and an inability to continue field duties safely. At the bottom, in the space for signature, was a faint impression in the paper, as if someone had pressed a pen there and hesitated. I heard footsteps then, approaching from the hallway. Slow, unhurried. I closed the book and stood, my heart pounding. The footsteps stopped just outside the locker room door. "Andrew," a voice said, not from the radio, not from the walls, but close enough that I could feel breath move the air. I remembered the rule. Do not acknowledge. Do not use names. Names establish continuity. I said nothing. The door opened. What stood there looked like a ranger at first glance. Same uniform, same patches, same posture. But the details didn't resolve correctly. The face was wrong in subtle ways, features slightly misaligned, like a composite built from memory rather than observation. It smiled, a careful, rehearsed expression. "You're late," it said in my voice. I didn't answer. Its smile faltered, just for a moment. It glanced past me, at the locker, at the rule book clutched in my hands. "Oh," it said. "You've read ahead." It stepped back, retreating down the hallway without turning around. I didn't follow. I waited until the sound of its footsteps faded completely, until the station felt empty again. I left the rulebook on the bench. I didn't lock it away. I didn't take it with me. Some instinct told me that possession no longer mattered, that the rules were no longer confined to paper. Before I left, I wrote one thing in the incident log. Just one sentence, vague enough to pass unnoticed, specific enough to feel honest. Irregularities observed. No action taken. Then I walked out. I don't know if my resignation was ever processed. I don't know if anyone noticed when I stopped showing up. What I do know is this: the forest has not followed me home. Whatever is bound by those rules, whatever needs them written and rewritten, seems tied to the boundaries of the park and the people who agree to serve within them. I think about the ranger who wrote the letter often. I wonder how long they lasted after leaving it behind. Whether the rules kept updating for them too. Whether leaving was enough. I folded the letter one last time and burned it in my sink, watching the words curl and blacken until nothing remained. Some knowledge isn't meant to be preserved. I have a new job now. It's ordinary, predictable, safe. I don't carry manuals anymore. I don't memorize procedures. But sometimes late at night, I'll hear my name spoken in a voice that sounds almost right, drifting in from the edge of sleep. When that happens, I don't respond. I lie still, eyes open, pretending I don't recognize it, trusting that as long as I refuse to acknowledge the call, no new rules will be written for me.